In the deep winter of 1944, on the frozen Ukrainian steppe, something quiet and terrible was about to break open. Nearly 250,000 men, German and their allies, found themselves caught in a closing circle of Soviet armies, and in the days that followed, that pocket would become one of the war's forgotten crucibles. The men inside did not know, in those final hours before the decision came, that the next 72 hours would determine whether they lived to see another winter at all. But let us begin where the silence was deepest, where the decision had not yet been made, where the snow still fell with its ancient indifference. January 1944. The steppe stretches in all directions, flat and white, and nearly featureless in the gathering darkness of late afternoon. The wind carries the cold, not from the north but from further east, from the vast interior of Russia itself, and it moves across the frozen ground with a sound almost like breathing. Here and there, half buried in the whiteness, are the trenches. They are not deep enough, never deep enough. The parapets are crusted with ice, and where the wind has scoured the snow away, you can see the frozen mud beneath, hard as stone. A soldier's breath, when he exhales, vanishes almost instantly into the air, and for a moment there is nothing but the white vapor and the cold. In the distance, perhaps 3 kilometers away, you might see the smoke rising from a destroyed vehicle, or perhaps it is only the drift of snow caught in some depression. It is difficult to tell, in this light, what is real and what is merely the eyes deceiving itself. The trenches are occupied, but sparsely. There are men here, certainly, but they have learned to move slowly, to conserve heat and breath. They stand in small groups, stamping their feet, without real hope that it will help. Their uniforms are white camouflaged, which means they fade into the landscape so thoroughly that you might walk past one without knowing he was there. This is both a comfort and a peculiar horror. They are hidden from the Soviet artillery observers across the way, but they are also invisible to any relief that might be coming. The artillery, when it comes, is less precise in this weather, but it comes often enough, and when it does, the men press themselves into the frozen earth and wait for it to pass. Behind the front line, if you could move through the darkness without being seen, you would find field kitchens where the cooks are struggling to keep something warm enough to eat. You would find horse lines where animals stand with frost rimmed around their eyes and nostrils, barely moving. You would find ammunition dumps and medical tents, and the usual debris of an army that has been moving and fighting continuously for weeks. And if you went deeper still, toward what the men call the heart of the pocket, you would find the headquarters tents, where officers are looking at maps by kerosene lamp, tracing with their fingers the lines that represent the Soviet positions surrounding them on nearly every side. This is the moment before knowledge becomes action, before the order that cannot be disobeyed becomes the desperate choice that saves or kills. For now, there is only the cold, and the snow, and the peculiar waiting that comes when you know you are surrounded, but have not yet accepted that you must move. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten corners of military history, where the grand strategy of empires touches the individual life of a single man in a frozen trench, I invite you to subscribe for more calm, deeply researched journeys through the lesser-known battles of the Eastern Front, including the full story of the Waffen-SS at Cherkassy and what it meant to survive the breakout through the snow. These are stories that deserve to be known, told without haste or distortion, the way history feels when you listen to it in the quiet hours. But before we move forward into what happened next, it is worth lingering here, in this moment of frozen waiting, and asking ourselves what brought these men to this place. The war on the Eastern Front had shifted in the months before this winter arrived. In previous years, the German armies had driven deep into Soviet territory, nearly to Moscow, nearly to the oil fields of the Caucasus. But Stalingrad had changed something. The vast encirclement and destruction of an entire German army in the rubble of that city had rippled backward through the entire German military establishment, and it had shown, for perhaps the first time, that the vast German machine could be stopped, could be trapped, could be broken. Then had come Kursk, in the summer of 1943, the largest tank battle the world has ever seen. And though the Germans had fought it fiercely and skillfully, it too had ended in a kind of defeat, or at least a failure to achieve what had been planned. The momentum, that indefinable but crucial thing in war, had shifted toward the Soviet armies. By January 1944, the Germans were fighting a different kind of war than they had been fighting in 1941 and 1942. They were no longer advancing, they were defending, retreating, and often simply trying to maintain a line that refused to stay still. The Soviet armies, having learned their hard lessons in the first years of the war, were now operating with a coordination and scale that was becoming formidable. They had learned to coordinate tank movements with infantry assaults, to concentrate their forces at decisive points, to use their overwhelming numerical advantage in artillery and manpower with increasing skill. It was in this context that the two German corps, which would soon find themselves encircled near the towns of Korsun and Cherkassy, were positioned along a front that stretched across the central Ukrainian steppe. The line they held was long and relatively weak. They were not being asked to hold an impenetrable wall, exactly, but rather to maintain a presence, to prevent a Soviet breakthrough that might unravel the entire German position in southern Russia. What no one anticipated, or perhaps what some anticipated, but could not prevent, was that the Soviets would not attempt a breakthrough at all, but would instead attempt something far more dangerous, an encirclement. The pincer was closing slowly through the weeks of December and into January. Soviet armies were moving around the flanks of the German positions, trying to meet on the other side, trying to complete the circle. The German commanders could see this happening. They could see the threat developing on their maps, but they were also subject to orders from above, from Berlin, from Hitler himself, and those orders, when they came, were absolute and often disconnected from the reality of the ground. It is a peculiarity of military hierarchies that a man sitting in a headquarters hundreds of kilometers away can order men in the snow to do something that those men know, with absolute certainty, will kill them. And yet the order comes, and the men obey, because that is what soldiers do. The encirclement, when it was finally complete, was like a hand closing. The Soviet armies met, and the circle was sealed. Inside the circle were portions of two German corps, roughly 200,000 men, though the exact number depended on how you counted, and on which of the many partial units and attached forces you included in your tally. These men were no longer fighting as part of a larger army stretching across Ukraine. They were now isolated, surrounded, cut off from supply and from retreat. Above all, they were cut off from the rest of Germany, and in that moment, in that cold, starlit night when the circle became complete, everything that would follow became inevitable, even though no one knew yet what that inevitability would look like. The snow continued to fall. The wind continued to carry the cold from the east, and in the trenches and in the command posts and in the makeshift hospitals that were filling with frostbite and dysentery, men began to understand, slowly or suddenly, that their lives had changed in a way that could not be changed back. And so the snow fell across the Ukrainian steppe that winter, as it had fallen for centuries before, indifferent to the uniforms beneath it or the flags claimed above it. The cold was absolute. The silence between the gunshots was the silence of a world waiting. But there is something peculiar about these moments in history, the ones that happened, the ones that cost thousands of lives and were whispered about in post-war cafes and military academies, yet somehow slipped sideways into the margins of what we remember. The Cherkassy Pocket is such a place. Not quite as famous as Stalingrad, not quite as mythologized as Kursk, yet every bit as brutal, every bit as human in its suffering and its small acts of survival. Have you ever wondered how certain battles fade into obscurity while others burn eternal in our collective memory? The answer often has less to do with the scale of what happened than with who was there to tell the story afterward, and how many times that story was retold before it settled into the shape we now accept. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten corners of military history, the moments when ideology meets winter, when distant orders collide with the reality of men trying to stay alive, we invite you to subscribe and journey with us through them. These are stories that demand patience to unfold, stories that live in the details of a single frozen night or the calculation behind a single divisional order. They are waiting in the snow, in the archives, in the testimony of those who survived to speak of what they saw. There is a particular kind of understanding that comes when you allow a narrative to move at the pace of actual time, when you sit with the cold as the soldiers sat with it, when you hear, not the triumphalist claims of either side, but the quieter voice that asks simply, what happened here, and what did it mean? The Eastern Front in January 1944 was a landscape of motion and consequence. The Germans had held this territory for so long that they had built their winter positions as though permanence were still possible, as though the Soviet Union were not gathering momentum like a massive, grinding machine that had already crushed one army after another into the steppe. Stalingrad had ended in November of 1942, and in the year that followed, the Soviets had learned. They had absorbed the lessons of their own defeats and begun to operate with a sophistication that caught many German commanders off guard. By the summer of 1943, at Kursk, the largest tank battle ever fought, the Germans had aimed to cut off Soviet bulges and regain the initiative. They had failed, and now, in the opening weeks of 1944, the Soviets were not waiting to be attacked, they were attacking. The winter itself was not the worst on record. That small mercy meant something to the men in the lines, though not much. It was still cold enough that frostbite became a constant concern, that engines had to be warmed continuously to function, that the simple act of surviving the night required fuel and shelter that were increasingly difficult to come by. The landscape was a study in whites and greys, white snow, grey sky, dark strips of frozen river, and the nearly black silhouettes of ruined villages that had changed hands multiple times in the past year. How does a landscape come to wear the weight of so much conflict? How does the earth itself seem to know what has been done upon it? Near the towns of Korsun and Cherkassy, in the bend of the Dnieper River, the German command had maintained a salient, a bulge in the line that extended forward into Soviet territory. Such salients had been common on the Eastern Front for months, and they had been held because they had always been held, because the orders to hold them had come from Berlin, and because at some level the German military still believed that will and discipline could overcome the raw mathematics of attrition. But the Soviets, by this point in the war, had learned to recognize salients not as inconveniences, but as opportunities. A salient is a bulge, and a bulge can be cut off at its base. A salient is an offering, if you have the strength to accept it. In January 1944, the Soviets accepted. By the winter of 1944, the Great Eastern Front had entered a phase that military historians would later recognize as a turning point, though those living through it could not yet know the shape of what was coming. The Red Army, hardened by catastrophe and sacrifice, had begun to move with a momentum that seemed almost inexorable, as though winter itself had become their ally. Behind them lay Stalingrad, a name that had become synonymous with both Soviet survival and German defeat, and more recently, the summer battle at Kursk, the largest tank engagement in human history, where German armor had thrown itself against prepared Soviet defenses and found them unbreakable. These were not mere tactical setbacks. They represented something far deeper, a fundamental shift in the balance of power on a continent-wide scale. The Germans, in early 1944, still controlled vast territories, stretching from France in the west to the edges of the Caucasus in the south, and deep into Soviet Union in the east. Yet control and security are not the same thing. The Wehrmacht's lines were long and increasingly thin, and the men holding them were growing aware, if only dimly, that the war they had thought would be won in the first summer of invasion was now entering its third winter. Command structures in Berlin still spoke of inevitable victory, of secret weapons, and of strategies that would turn the tide, but in the field, among the officers and soldiers who had to make decisions with incomplete information and with cold, stiffened fingers, the uncertainty was palpable. Consider the strategic situation as it appeared in January of that year. Hitler's forces occupied a vast arc of territory, But maintaining that occupation required constant reinforcement, constant vigilance, and an enemy that cooperated with German plans. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had been ruthlessly reorganizing its entire war economy. Factories had been moved east, beyond the reach of German bombers. Production lines that had been devastated in the early invasion had been rebuilt and expanded. The Red Army itself, purged of many officers in the terrible purges of the 1930s, had nonetheless developed new cadres of capable commanders, men like Zhukov and Konev, who were learning to coordinate massive forces across enormous distances with an operational sophistication that matched, and in some ways exceeded, that of their German counterparts. The Soviet strategy that emerged after Kursk was one of continuous offensive pressure. Rather than defending passively, the Soviet High Command had adopted what they called active defense, which meant pushing forward whenever and wherever possible, stretching German resources to their breaking point. The idea was elegant in its brutality. Keep the enemy moving, keep them off balance, force them to commit reserves to plugging gaps, and eventually, the Wehrmacht would fracture under the strain. In the winter of 1943 and into early 1944, the Soviets launched offensive after offensive. The Germans, attempting to maintain their lines with insufficient resources and poorly supplied relief forces, found themselves constantly reacting rather than acting. Each German division committed to holding a position was a division not available for counterattack. Each mile of territory that could not be abandoned was a mile that had to be held, regardless of the strategic logic. What made this winter particularly deadly was not just the strategic pressure, but the way it amplified the physical suffering. The snow on the Ukrainian steppe was not merely an inconvenience, it was an adversary that did not recognize rank or ideology, that killed with the same indifference whether you wore a swastika or a red star on your uniform. Frostbite claimed limbs. Dysentery, a constant companion in the Wehrmacht's field armies, was particularly virulent in winter because men could not maintain proper hygiene in the frozen ground. Supply lines that were difficult in autumn became nearly impossible in the depths of winter, particularly when Soviet forces were simultaneously disrupting them through partisan activity and conventional attacks. The question that military historians often ask is whether the German High Command fully understood, in January 1944, how critical the situation had become. The evidence suggests a picture of profound uncertainty and, perhaps, willful denial at the highest levels. Hitler received situation reports that minimized losses and emphasized defensive successes. Field commanders, who saw the reality of the thinning lines and exhausted men, often had their assessments dismissed or contradicted by orders from Berlin that seemed divorced from the facts on the ground. In this atmosphere of growing tension between what was true and what was hoped to be true, several German corps found themselves advancing or holding positions in the Ukraine that would soon become precarious. The Iron-Axle German Corps, along with elements of the 1st Panzer Army, were engaged in various defensive operations in early 1944. Some held salient positions, places where the front line bulged outward, exposed on three sides to Soviet attack. Others were attempting limited offensives or counteroffensives, trying to restore a more favorable line. None of them could have known that within weeks, converging Soviet armies would encircle them near a pair of small towns on the Ukrainian steppe, and that the resulting pocket, what historians would come to call the Cherkassy Pocket, or sometimes the Korsun Pocket, would become one of the most infamous struggles of the entire war. The weather was turning slightly as January progressed, not warm enough to bring any relief, but warm enough to hint at the thaw that would come with spring, and that thaw would bring its own terrible complications. For now, though, the snow lay thick and undisturbed across vast spaces where no armies had yet clashed, waiting for the next wave of violence to arrive. The silence of those white fields was deceptive. Beneath the quiet, forces were gathering. Intelligence officers were assembling reports. Commanders were making calculations. Trucks were being loaded with ammunition and supplies. The great machine of war was winding up for another turn. By the third week of January 1944, the geometry of the trap was already becoming apparent to those who could read the maps in the divisional command posts of the 8th Army. Two German corps, the 11th Corps under General Hermann Braith, and the Slee Corps, commanded by General Max Knobelsdorff, were holding a sector of the Eastern Front near the bend of the Dnieper River, not far from the towns of Korsun and Cherkassy, small places that would soon become fixed in the memory of hundreds of thousands of men. The winter landscape around them was vast and white and nearly featureless, stretching away in every direction under a pale grey sky, and somewhere beyond that horizon, Soviet armies were moving with increasing precision and speed. The Red Army, it seemed, had learned how to conduct large-scale operations with a fluidity that had been impossible just a year or two before. Zhukov and his marshals had been studying German methods, and they had begun to improve upon them. The Soviet strategy, though the German commanders in the pocket could not yet see it whole, was unfolding according to a pattern that would become tragically familiar before the month was finished. The Russian armies to the north and south of the German position had begun to move simultaneously in a vast encircling motion, like two hands slowly closing around a held object, and the gap between them was narrowing week by week, sometimes day by day. To the north, one Soviet army group was driving westward. To the south, another was pushing north and west, and the mathematical reality of their converging trajectories meant that the two German corps, if they remained where they were, would find themselves cut off from the rest of the Wehrmacht, isolated in a pocket of shrinking territory, dependent on supplies that would have to be flown in or driven through corridors that were closing. How could such a situation have been allowed to develop? The answer lay partly in the friction that always exists between distant headquarters and the men in the field, partly in the vast distances of the steppe and the difficulty of seeing clearly across such terrain, and partly in the momentum of war itself, which sometimes carries commanders forward into positions that their own logic should have warned them to avoid. The terrain around Cherkassy was not mountainous or even particularly broken. It was rolling country in places, but generally the landscape was open, offering little protection from observation or artillery fire. The Dnieper River curved through the region, and the smaller rivers and streams that fed into it provided some natural features around which defensive positions could be anchored. But such lines were only as strong as the men who held them and the supplies that reached them. By mid-January, the Germans holding this sector were aware that something was wrong. The Soviet artillery fire was increasing in intensity and frequency. Reports from reconnaissance patrols spoke of large concentrations of enemy forces. The roads behind German lines were becoming congested, with supplies moving toward the front, a sign that someone in the higher command was trying to reinforce the position, or at least ensure it was well stocked before something more serious happened. Radio intercepts suggested enemy activity on a scale that was not merely tactical but strategic, and yet the order to hold the line remained unchanged. The mechanics of encirclement are slow at first and then suddenly very fast. The outer ring of the Soviet armies had to move into position, and that took time. Armies cannot simply leap across terrain, they must move through it, which means roads, rivers, the logistics of feeding men and ammunition, the coordination of dozens of units across vast distances. During the first week of the encirclement, if it could yet be called that, it was still theoretically possible to break out or to reinforce the position from outside, though no such order came. The German divisions and corps holding the sector dug in deeper, improved their fortifications, and waited for something to clarify, for someone to give a decisive order, for the situation to reveal itself as either manageable or catastrophic. But encirclement operates according to a peculiar logic, one that becomes clearer only with time. There is a moment before it becomes obvious, a moment of perhaps days or even hours, when the situation is ambiguous, when escape is still possible, but also when it remains unintelligible to those who might make the decision to escape. By the time clarity arrives, the window of opportunity has often closed. Was this what had happened here on the Ukrainian steppe? The evidence suggests that it had. The commanders in the pocket seem not to have fully grasped, even as late as mid-January, that they were already surrounded, or nearly so, or that the decision to attempt a breakout would need to be made very soon indeed, before the Soviet ring tightened so far that escape became not merely difficult, but nearly impossible. The Soviet armies continued to move, in the snow and cold, toward their converging objective. The encirclement was taking shape, not as a sudden dramatic maneuver, but as a methodical tightening, like a surgeon's hands slowly closing around an object. And each day that passed made the geometry of escape more severe, the distances longer, the chances of success smaller. Within the pocket, the men of the 8th Army and its subordinate formations, the Wehrmacht divisions with their men conscripted into service, the volunteers of the Waffen-SS, the foreign volunteers who had come to the Eastern Front for reasons ranging from ideology to mercenary interest to simple coercion, all of them were beginning to understand that something was happening that had not happened to them before, or if it had not ended well. They were being encircled. The snow continued to fall, the temperature continued to drop, and the Soviet ring, though it was not yet complete, was drawing tight. Within those closing walls of snow and earth, something remarkable had gathered, not merely soldiers, but a particular constellation of Nazi Germany's remaining forces, each bearing their own history and burden. The 11th Army, under General Karl Adolf Strecker, formed the core of the trapped command, anchored by veteran Wehrmacht divisions whose lineages stretched back through years of Russian fighting. The 13th Corps and 5th Corps, diminished but still organized, held sections of the shrinking perimeter as the Soviet pincers continued their patient contraction across the frozen steppe. These were men who had seen Moscow's suburbs, men who had retreated through mud and snow before, men whose faces had grown gaunt with the understanding that Germany's war in the East was no longer advancing, but merely persisting. But woven through these conventional Wehrmacht formations ran another thread entirely, the Waffen-SS Viking Division, a unit unlike those raised from German conscription alone. Composed largely of foreign volunteers, Nordic recruits from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, who had answered Nazi racial ideology's particular call, the Viking had earned a fearsome reputation across 3 years of Eastern Front combat. They arrived at Cherkassy already steeped in blood, already mythologized in SS propaganda as supermen of the northern races, though the reality beneath the mythology was far more complicated. Here they stood, surrounded like everyone else, as vulnerable to cold and bullets, and the grinding mathematics of encirclement as any other soldier. The Vikings' men clutched their rifles in frozen fingers, their Nordic faces lined with hunger and exhaustion, their ideological fervor tested by the simple, crushing weight of circumstance. What does it mean to believe in racial superiority when you are starving in a pocket alongside men you were taught to despise? Alongside the Viking, another formation occupied an even stranger place in this gathering of the trapped, the Walloon Volunteer Brigade, a unit of Belgian collaborators who had enlisted in the German cause and fought under SS colours. These were men drawn from the French-speaking territories of Belgium, ideologically committed to Nazism or simply caught in the undertow of war's brutal logic. They too faced the encirclement with whatever courage or resignation they could muster, their fate now bound to Germany's and to the other soldiers pressed against them in the shrinking perimeter. The presence of such foreign volunteers complicates any simple reading of who was trapped in that pocket and why. These were not conscripts from the Reich itself, but men who had chosen, through conviction or coercion or circumstance, to fight beneath the swastika. The total trapped force, though estimates vary and precise numbers remain contested by historians, likely numbered somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 soldiers, a substantial combat force, and yet one that found itself geometrically disadvantaged, forced to hold a perimeter of ever-tightening circumference, with fewer men each day as the pocket compressed. Within this vast trapped formation moved officers and NCOs struggling to maintain order, supply sergeants rationing diminishing stores of ammunition and food, doctors setting bones and binding wounds in overcrowded dugouts. And moving through them all, visible and invisible, was the peculiar psychology of men who understand they might not see home again. Not all of them, of course. Many still believed in the relief attempt, still trusted the assurances from higher command that German panzer forces would punch through to rescue them. Others harbored quieter doubts, the kind of thoughts that surface in long Arctic nights when a man lies in a frozen trench and contemplates the mathematics of his own survival. The Wehrmacht divisions, professional soldiers bound by military discipline and tradition, held certain sectors with the grim efficiency born of years on the Eastern Front. They had adapted to winter warfare through bitter experience. Survival depended on understanding the cold as an enemy, as formidable as the Soviets themselves. They knew how to preserve body heat, how to maintain weapons in sub-zero temperatures, how to pace their expenditure of energy when calories grew scarce. The Waffen-SS Viking division operated under a different calculus, animated by ideological fervor and elite cohesion, reinforced by the particular mythology that surrounded SS units. These men had been told they were superior, and perhaps some still believed it, even as the cold exposed all men to the same vulnerability, the same hunger. The Walloon Brigade, smallest of these contingents, navigated an even stranger existence, foreign volunteers for a foreign cause, now trapped in a nightmare that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with snow and survival. What binds them together in memory, as the hours of encirclement accumulated and the perimeter continued its terrible compression, is not shared conviction, but shared fate. A Wehrmacht major and an SS Nordic volunteer and a Belgian collaboratist now existed in the same pocket, breathing the same thin, frozen air, exposed to the same artillery barrages, rationed the same dwindling supplies. The differences that had seemed so important, uniform insignia, racial doctrine, national origin, became gradually less relevant than proximity to a fire, access to a scrap of food, the chance to shelter in a dugout rather than endure the open cold. History tends to separate these men into categories, to judge them according to ideology and allegiance. But in the lived moment of encirclement, in the hour-to-hour struggle of a pocket slowly contracting around frozen men, such categories dissolved into something simpler and far more human. Soldiers together, waiting in the snow, uncertain what the next day would bring. Inside the pocket, the world had contracted to the space between two Soviet rings, and survival had become a matter of arithmetic, so precise and merciless that even the most seasoned soldiers found themselves counting on their fingers like children. The cold, which had already become a companion to every breath, now deepened into something almost personal, a presence that occupied the same tent, the same foxhole, the same thin bedroll as the men who endured it. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees Celsius on the better nights, and on others, the thermometer would plummet toward -30, turning the snow into something crystalline and brittle, so hard that a man's boot might crunch with each step, a sound that in the terrible silence of the steppe seemed to announce his presence to every enemy within kilometers. The rations, which had begun the encirclement with a certain adequacy, now thinned like morning mist. A soldier might expect his allotment for the day, a small tin of meat, bread, if it had not frozen solid into an inedible brick, perhaps some fat, and on fortunate occasions, a pinch of coffee or a small measure of schnapps. But as the days accumulated and the pocket shrank, these portions became almost ceremonial in their brevity. A man would receive what looked like a proper meal, only to realize, once he held it in his numb hands, that it represented perhaps a third of what his body actually needed to maintain warmth and strength. The mathematics of hunger became one of the first lessons of encirclement. How long could a man survive on 200 calories when his body was burning perhaps 3,000 just to keep from freezing? The officers, of course, asked themselves this question in their command posts. The enlisted men did not need to ask. They could feel the answer in the hollowing of their bellies and the lightness that began to creep into their limbs. The horses suffered perhaps even more visibly than the men, and this suffering carried its own particular anguish. The Wehrmacht and especially the SS divisions relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. There was no way around this dependency, despite all the mechanization the modern army had achieved. A cavalry horse needs roughly 15 kilograms of fodder daily. In the pocket, there was no fodder, there was snow, and the men could watch, day after day, as the animals grew thinner, their ribs becoming visible beneath dull coats, their eyes taking on that glassy, inward expression of creatures losing the will to survive. When a horse could no longer stand, when it had become simply a liability and a waste of what little food remained, someone had to make the decision. A shot would ring out across the frozen ground, and then the corpse would be butchered. This was not unusual in wartime, not unusual at all, and yet there is something about the death of horses that seems to carry a particular weight, a particular sadness. These were not soldiers who had chosen to be here. They had no understanding of encirclement, or strategy, or the grand movements of armies. They had simply been brought to the steppe and expected to pull the guns and the sleds and the supply wagons across ice and snow. By the second week of the pocket's existence, the horse population had declined dramatically. What had been a considerable transport fleet became merely adequate. What was merely adequate became desperately scarce. The officers worked constantly on the mathematics of survival, redistributing rations, estimating how many days' worth of supplies remained in the ammunition and fuel dumps, making the kinds of calculations that in earlier, easier times would have been handled by comfortable men in warm headquarters offices. Here, in freezing command posts, cigarette smoke curling and freezing almost instantly in the air, they tried to pass what was actually possible. Could they hold out if the relief column broke through by a certain date? How many more men could they lose before the pocket became simply indefensible? What would it mean to surrender? These were not abstract military questions anymore. They had become deeply personal, a matter of deciding whether friends and subordinates would live or die. The psychological weight of encirclement operates differently from the weight of other wartime stresses. A man in the line, even under heavy artillery fire, retains a certain illusion of possibility. He might be killed today, certainly, but he is not trapped. In theory, he could retreat, could move laterally, could imagine scenarios of survival that involve remaining alive in various places. In the pocket, this illusion dissolves. The horizon on every side is occupied by enemies. The only direction that leads to safety is the one the army decides to move, and even that direction is uncertain until orders come from above. The men tried to maintain routines. They dug deeper into their positions, laid out fields of fire, maintained their weapons, because maintenance was something to do, and doing something, even something small, and perhaps ultimately futile, helped to push back against the weight of helplessness. The Waffen-SS units, and particularly the Viking division, maintained discipline more rigidly perhaps than some of their Wehrmacht counterparts, but even they felt the slow erosion of morale that comes with encirclement. Letters home, when they could be written, and when there was any possibility of them ever leaving the pocket, took on a particular tone. They were either studiously optimistic, full of promises of reunion and statements that all would be well, or they were indirect, careful, coded language that wives and mothers might read between to understand that the men understood the gravity of their situation. Some letters were never written at all, because how do you tell your family that you are surrounded by 500,000 Soviet soldiers and that the relief column might not come in time, or might not come at all? At night, in the deeper cold, when the wind rose across the steppe with a sound like something alive, the men would huddle together in groups, sharing body heat, listening to the sounds of the pocket, the distant rumble of guns, the crack of trees freezing, the occasional burst of small arms fire when one side probed the other. The sounds of a shrinking world, growing quieter, more intimate, more desperate with each passing day. There was very little talking in those dark hours. Men thought about food they had eaten in other winters, in other places. They thought about homes that seemed to exist now only in memory, impossible distances away, separated from the pocket, not by geography so much as by circumstance, and the terrible momentum of events that had brought them to this frozen ground, and would not, for many of them, allow them to leave it alive. The Waffen-SS units holding ground within that darkening pocket were themselves products of a longer, stranger history than many realize. The Viking Division, which would find itself among those frozen encircled men, had begun its existence not as a German formation at all, but as something far more ambitious in its conception, a dream, perhaps one might say, of creating a multinational volunteer force drawn from across the Germanic peoples of Europe. It was formed in the winter of 1940, at a moment when that particular ideology believed such a thing might be possible, that the call to common cause could reach across borders and languages and bind men together under a single banner. The men who answered that call came from places both near and far. Norwegians arrived, Swedes and Finns, Danes and Dutchmen, even some volunteers from further afield, drawn by the promise of adventure or conviction or simple circumstance. There were Flemish-speaking Belgians and men from the Baltic states, whose nations had only recently vanished into the Soviet sphere. Each brought his own language, his own understanding of what this war meant, his own reasons for being there in the snow. For some, it was ideological commitment, a genuine belief in the cause. For others, it was the closing of options, the way empires and occupations narrow a young man's choices. And for still others, perhaps, it was simply the adventure that war offers when you are young enough to believe you might survive it. The division itself had earned a peculiar reputation even before the winter of 1944 came to trap it. It had fought on the Eastern Front since 1941, which meant it had witnessed the entire arc of that catastrophic struggle from the early German victories through the mounting horror and stalemate. It had been present at the siege of Leningrad, where men suffered and froze, and hunger became as much an enemy as any soldier in the opposing trenches. It had fought during the great turning point at Stalingrad, though it was not encircled there, as so many other divisions were. It had participated in the desperate counterattacks that followed, in the grinding attritional warfare that defined the Eastern Front year after year. What set the Viking Division apart from its multinational character, was the way it had developed a certain kind of cohesion born from shared suffering and shared distance. These men were, in many ways, outsiders within the larger German army. They spoke different languages around their fires. They maintained, at least in some measure, connections to homelands that no longer existed or were under German occupation. They were volunteers, which meant they carried a different psychological weight than conscripts, and yet as the war stretched on, as the initial fervor of 1940 and 1941 faded into the grinding reality of survival, the distinction between volunteer and conscript became increasingly meaningless. Everyone was simply trying to stay alive. The division's character, too, had been shaped by its commanders and its experience. By the time we arrive at Cherkassy, it was under officers who had learned hard lessons about survival in this particular kind of warfare. They understood the Eastern Front in a way that rear echelon planners in Berlin could not. They had seen the vastness of the Russian steppe, the seemingly infinite reserves of men, the way winter came with a savagery that Western Europeans had rarely encountered. They knew what it meant to fight a war of attrition against an enemy that could always produce more men, more tanks, more artillery, because the enemy's home lay just beyond the horizon. The Viking Division had also, by this point in the war, absorbed something of the character of the men it fought among. The Wehrmacht units that surrounded them in the pocket were professionals, many of them career soldiers who had fought in France and North Africa and now found themselves in the depths of Russia. The Waffen-SS units carried the ideological intensity of their organization, but years of combat had ground away at ideology in ways that perhaps only those who have truly experienced war can understand. You cannot hold an abstraction in your arms when that abstraction is bleeding to death in the snow. You cannot believe in grand historical forces when you are trying to find fuel for vehicles that need to move, or men will die. Consider, if you will, what it meant to be one of those Viking volunteers by January 1944. You had been at war for nearly 3 years. You had seen friends die, had killed men whose faces you might still remember if you allowed yourself to. You had stood watch in trenches so cold that frost formed on your eyelashes, where the simple act of breathing could damage your lungs. You had eaten rations that grew thinner by the month, had watched horses die of hunger, had learned to take comfort in small things: a cup of hot ersatz coffee, a moment out of the wind, a letter from home that had taken months to arrive and spoke of a world that seemed increasingly unreal. And now, in this darkening pocket, you found yourself part of a force that had been deemed expendable by the High Command, or so it seemed. The orders came down from distant Berlin, from headquarters far removed from the sound of Soviet artillery and the cry of wounded men. Hold your ground. Do not retreat. Reinforcements are coming. How many times had you heard such things? How many times had they proved false? There was a peculiar psychology that developed in such moments, a kind of hardened acceptance mixed with desperate hope. The hope was perhaps the more dangerous of the two, because it could keep you fighting long after reason suggested you should surrender, should find some way out of the trap that was closing. The Wiking Division, by all accounts, maintained its discipline through those early days of encirclement. The men were exhausted, certainly, and frightened, though fear was something one learned not to speak of after long enough at war. But they held their positions, they followed orders, they did their duties. There is something almost meditative about that kind of repetition, that kind of routine, maintained in the face of catastrophe. You clean your weapon, you stand your watch, you eat what you are given, you try not to think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead in such circumstances is rarely helpful. The question of why these men remained in the pocket, why they did not simply walk away or surrender, is one worth sitting with for a moment. Surrender itself was not an entirely safe proposition. Stories had circulated about Soviet treatment of Waffen-SS soldiers, about the particular hatred that communist forces directed toward what they saw as fascist units. Whether these stories were entirely accurate or somewhat exaggerated by fear and rumor, they shaped behavior. A man might be more willing to die trying to break through German lines than to risk falling into Soviet hands. There was also, one suspects, a kind of inertia built into military discipline itself. You follow orders because that is what you have been trained to do, because the alternative, chaos, abandoning your comrades, the dissolution of everything that has held together your small group, seems worse than continuing forward. From Moscow, far from the frozen fields of Ukraine, two of the Soviet Union's most formidable commanders had already set their eyes upon the German forces moving through the steppe. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, a man whose patience with incompetence was as thin as the winter ice itself, had been orchestrating the broader Eastern strategy with a ruthlessness born from hard experience. Beside him, Ivan Stepanovich Konev, equally methodical and equally hungry for decisive victory, controlled armies that had learned through bitter winters and countless engagements precisely how to close a trap and hold it tight. These two men did not act in isolation. They moved as extensions of Stalin's will, answering to the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, where strategy flowed downward like a river finding its course through the landscape. The Soviet plan that took shape in those early days of 1944 was designed not merely to encircle the German force. Encirclement alone would have been a tactical achievement, noteworthy but incomplete. What Zhukov and Konev sought was something far more ambitious and, if we are honest, far more brutal: the complete annihilation of everything trapped within the closing jaws of their armies. This was not a new impulse in Soviet strategy. The vast open spaces of the steppe, the way armies could move across seemingly endless terrain, had already taught both sides that speed and convergence were everything. A trapped force in such spaces faced not merely defeat, but potential extinction, cut off from supply, surrounded by overwhelming firepower, with the only escape route being the one your enemy controls or conceal at will. The converging armies were substantial. Konev's Second Ukrainian Front advanced from the southwest, columns of tanks and mechanized infantry pushing through the snow, their supply lines stretching behind them across the frozen landscape like threads spun across white cloth. Zhukov's armies, elements of the Voronezh Front under Nikolai Vatutin, another commander of considerable skill, pressed down from the north and northeast, creating a pincer movement that was meant to meet and link up, sealing the Germans inside a shrinking pocket. The coordination between these advancing forces required not only excellent communication, but also the kind of confidence that comes only from experience. These Soviet commanders had learned their trade through countless engagements across the vast theater of the Eastern Front, and they had learned it thoroughly. What made this encirclement strategy particularly devastating, at least from the Soviet perspective, was the psychological and strategic concept behind it. In earlier years of the war, German forces had proven remarkably skilled at breaking out of encirclement, using concentration of force, superior discipline, and mobile tactics to punch holes in what the Soviets thought were secure positions. But by 1944, the balance had shifted. Soviet forces had grown larger, better equipped, and the sheer numerical advantage, especially in artillery, meant that holding an encirclement was increasingly possible. If you could bring sufficient firepower to bear across a wide enough perimeter, and if you could move your forces quickly enough to prevent relief columns from breaking through, then the enemy inside had nowhere to go. Zhukov understood this arithmetic with the clarity of a man who had studied military theory before becoming military practice incarnate. The concentration of Soviet resources, particularly artillery, the dominant weapon in Soviet military doctrine, would make the walls of the pocket increasingly lethal the longer they remained intact. Every day that passed without a successful breakout or relief attack increased the likelihood that those walls would hold. Can you imagine the Soviet command structure looking down at maps marked with the advancing fronts, watching the gap between Konev's forces and Zhukov's armies narrowing, calculating the moment when the encirclement would be complete, and, more importantly, irreversible? The strategy of annihilation also rested upon something more subtle but no less important: the cutting off of supply. A force surrounded cannot be supplied from the air if the enemy controls the skies above, and by early 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to conduct sustained airlift operations was becoming increasingly questionable. A force surrounded cannot receive reinforcements unless those reinforcements can punch through the encircling lines, and that becomes harder with every day that passes, as the enemy inside is necessarily weakening through hunger, cold, and casualties. The Soviets knew this. They had lived through sieges and encirclement themselves, and the knowledge was etched into their strategic thinking like frost on a window pane. Within the converging Soviet armies, there was also a pragmatic understanding that this encirclement, if managed correctly, could yield dividends far beyond the immediate battlefield. The destruction of 2 German corps on the steppe would not only remove those divisions from the order of battle, it would also reverberate through the German command structure, creating ripples of demoralization and forcing a reassessment of German capabilities in the East. Moreover, it would demonstrate to Stalin and to the world that Soviet strategy had matured beyond the desperate, improvised reactions of earlier in the war. Here was methodical, well-coordinated operations between multiple fronts, moving with precision toward a calculated objective. This was warfare as science rather than chaos. Konev's forces, pushing up from the southwest, faced terrain that was difficult but not insurmountable. The snow, while thick in places, had not yet given way to the bottomless mud that spring would bring. His armies moved with a purpose born from clear orders and the confidence that comes from superior numbers. Zhukov's armies from the north pressed forward with equal determination, and somewhere in the space between these two massive forces, the German and SS units were beginning to realize the full extent of their predicament. The Soviet High Command was patient. Annihilation, after all, cannot be rushed. It can only be ensured through the methodical tightening of the noose. What neither Zhukov nor Kornev could control with complete precision was the weather. They could plan and coordinate, they could concentrate forces and synchronize movements, but the Eastern Front had taught every commander, German and Soviet alike, that winter operated according to its own logic. The snow that fell in January might remain firm enough for rapid troop movement one day and become a treacherous maze of drifts the next. The cold that preserved roads by keeping them frozen would eventually, in early spring, turn those same roads into rivers of mud. This is perhaps what makes the strategy of encirclement so inherently uncertain in such a landscape. Nature itself becomes an unpredictable element in the equation, independent of the desires or calculations of even the most brilliant generals. In the frozen bunkers and command posts scattered across that shrinking pocket of snow and ice, the trapped commanders faced a peculiar form of torment that had nothing to do with Soviet artillery or the relentless cold seeping through their uniforms. The agony came from above, from distant Berlin, where Adolf Hitler sat in his concrete headquarters and refused to acknowledge the reality of the men dying in the snow. The order came through in those early days of February, stark and absolute, transmitted over radio and telephone lines that crackled with static and consequence. Hold, do not retreat, do not yield. The pocket would be relieved. Reinforcements were coming. Resistance must be maintained at all costs. It was, in essence, the same order that had been given at Stalingrad, and at Normandy, and at 100 other shrinking circles of German territory. And the field commanders, men like General Wilhelm Stemmermann, who commanded the German forces in the pocket, or the officers of the Waffen-SS Viking division, who had fought across Ukraine and Russia for years, found themselves suspended between two impossible choices: obey the Führer and watch their men perish in the snow from hunger and cold and overwhelming enemy fire, holding ground that would eventually be taken anyway, or disobey, take matters into their own hands, and risk court-martial or worse for insubordination. The distance between the frozen steppe and the Führer's headquarters in Rastenburg was more than mere geography. It was a chasm of comprehension, a gap between the man who lived in a carefully controlled environment, surrounded by adjutants and aides who filtered and shaped information to match his worldview, and the commanders in the field, who watched their soldiers freeze to death each night, their horses collapse from starvation, their ammunition dwindle without replacement. Berlin did not understand, or perhaps did not wish to understand, what it meant to be surrounded in winter. The cold itself became a form of communication that no radio operator could properly translate upward. How do you explain frostbite to a man in a heated bunker? How do you convey the sound of men weeping from hunger when all he hears are reports of tactical positions? General Stemmermann, a career officer with decades of military experience, would later describe the tension of those days with a kind of exhausted resignation. He received detailed instructions from Wehrmacht High Command about how the relief would proceed, what direction it would come from, what the timeline would be. And each day, as that relief failed to arrive in force, as General Breith's 3rd Panzer Corps struggled through conditions that no panzer could truly overcome, the gap between promise and reality widened like a crevasse in an ice field. The friction was not merely about strategy or disagreement over military doctrine. It was personal, deeply human, arising from the fundamental disconnect between those who gave orders and those who bore the consequences of those orders. The officers in the pocket began to lose faith, not just in the military situation, but in the command structure itself. Reports came back from reconnaissance patrols about the Soviet strength surrounding them, about the impossible odds, about the narrowing window of time before the entire force would be annihilated, and still the orders from Berlin remained unchanged. The psychological effect on the men, and on the officers trying to maintain discipline among them, was corrosive. A soldier can accept death in combat, can understand sacrifice in an attack with some possibility of breakthrough or success. But to freeze and starve and die while ordered to stand in place, waiting for relief that does not arrive, that is a different form of psychological torture. The men in the pocket began to ask their officers, quietly at first, then with increasing directness, whether Berlin actually understood where they were, what they faced, whether anyone in the high command truly cared whether they lived or died, and the officers, many of them, had no answer that would satisfy them or themselves. They could only say, hold position, maintain discipline, trust in the Führer's judgment. Trust. That fragile word became almost unbearable to speak. There was another element to this tension, one that is often overlooked in accounts of the Cherkassy Pocket. The Waffen-SS units trapped inside, including the men of the Wiking Division, occupied a strange and complicated position within the broader German military hierarchy. They answered ultimately to Hitler, to the SS leadership structure in Berlin, just as much as they answered to Wehrmacht commanders in the field. This created competing lines of authority, competing interpretations of orders, competing ideas about what should happen next. The SS officers in the pocket had their own communication channels to Berlin, their own reporting structures, their own considerations about what would happen to them personally if they disobeyed orders, or if they were blamed for a failure to hold the pocket. Were they to prioritize Wehrmacht unity and follow General Stemmermann's lead, or were they to maintain the integrity of the SS chain of command? The question was never explicitly asked, but it hung over every discussion, every argument, every decision made in those frozen command bunkers. By the beginning of the second week of the encirclement, a kind of quiet insubordination was taking root among the commanders in the pocket. Not outright rebellion, nothing so dramatic, but rather a growing conviction that the orders from Berlin had become divorced from reality to such a degree that following them would amount to a death sentence for everyone. Officers began to take small actions, to prepare contingencies, to gather intelligence about possible breakout routes, while still maintaining the appearance of obedience to the stand-fast order. They stockpiled what few supplies remained. They consolidated their forces into tighter groupings that could move more efficiently. They began quiet conversations with each other about what might need to happen if, when, the situation became completely untenable. It was a delicate dance, a form of military insubordination so subtle that it could not be called such, yet it was clearly happening. And all the while, the radio continued to crackle with messages from Berlin, each one reinforcing the order to hold, to resist, to believe in victory, or at least in honorable death in place. The weather, too, seemed to mock the orders coming from headquarters. As January turned toward the last days before the breakthrough attempt would begin in earnest, a thaw set in. The snow that had been so deep and paralyzing began to soften. The frozen ground became mud. The roads that were already impassable became even more so. Relief columns struggled more desperately to reach the pocket. And still, Berlin's orders remained absolute. It is hard to say with certainty whether the High Command was receiving accurate information about the thaw and its impact on operations, or whether that information was being filtered and shaped by subordinates who believed that admitting the true conditions would weaken the Führer's resolve. Military communication in wartime is always imperfect, always subject to distortion, always carrying the biases and fears of the men transmitting the information. But somewhere in that gap, between Berlin and the frozen steppe, the weight of reality was building like pressure behind a dam. The officers in the pocket felt it, the men knew it, and the moment was approaching when that dam would break, when the stand-fast order would be superseded by the simple, undeniable necessity of survival. While the pocket contracted around Korsun and Cherkassy, a German general named Walter Breith was preparing what would become one of the war's most desperate rescue attempts, though rescue in such circumstances is perhaps too hopeful a word, a breakout then, or an effort to punch a hole through which trapped men might escape. Breith commanded 3 Panzer Corps, and the order had come down through the Wehrmacht hierarchy with the weight of Hitler's own frustration behind it. Drive south through the winter steppe, break through the Soviet encirclement, and link up with the trapped divisions before they dissolved entirely in hunger and cold. It was the kind of order that sounds straightforward until you consider the landscape, the weather, the enemy's density, and the fact that German reserves in early 1944 were stretched so thin across such enormous distances that what Breith could gather resembled less a relief force and more a collection of battered remnants. The 3 Panzer Corps, when it began its advance toward the pocket in late January, consisted of scattered panzer and panzer grenadier divisions, units that had seen continuous combat on the Eastern Front and carried with them the cumulative exhaustion of 3 years of warfare in hostile terrain. The Luftwaffe provided some air support in intervals when weather permitted, But the skies over Ukraine that winter were often grey and impenetrable, forcing Breath's men to advance without the cushion of aerial reconnaissance or close air support that might have eased their passage. The roads, if they could be called roads, were frozen mud transformed into frozen quagmires by the passage of countless vehicles before them, and the snow lay deep enough in places to halt a half-track or force a tank to move at a crawl. Can you imagine the sound of those engines labouring, the grinding of tracks, and the splatter of half-frozen mud against armour, the exhaust rising into the bitter air? Breath's strategy was to drive southwestward from his assembly positions, pushing through the Soviet outer lines and reaching the pocket along whatever corridor he could force open. The Soviets, of course, anticipated this. Zhukov's forces had designed the encirclement not as a simple trap, but as a layered defensive system, with reserves positioned precisely where relief columns would most logically attempt breakthrough. The mathematics of the situation were grim. Breath could field perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 men in his advance, while the Soviets had committed hundreds of thousands to the encirclement and the prevention of any German counterattack. It was a mismatch so severe that one begins to wonder whether anyone in Berlin truly believed the relief could succeed, or whether they sent Breath forward knowing he would fail but wanting to appear, for the record, to have tried. The advance began on January 26th, in conditions that were neither snow nor sleet, but some terrible combination of both, a precipitation that clung to uniforms and equipment and sapped away body heat with the methodical patience of hypothermia. The panzer crews, buttoned up inside their steel shells, experienced the cold differently than the infantry, but no less acutely. There was no heating system adequate to a Ukrainian winter, and the metal conducted the cold into the cabin with pitiless efficiency. The panzer grenadiers riding on the vehicles huddled against one another, their breath creating sheets of ice on the inside surfaces of canvas and metal. As the columns pushed forward, they encountered Soviet defensive positions, not major strongholds but distributed outposts and anti-tank guns, concealed in the snow-covered landscape. The Soviets fought knowing they had numbers, territory, and time all on their side. The Germans fought knowing they had only the possibility of reaching the pocket before it was too late. One of the most poignant aspects of Breath's advance was the nature of communication between the relief force and the trapped pocket. Radio contact was intermittent. Conditions and Soviet jamming made reliable transmission uncertain, so for much of the journey, the men in the pocket did not know whether Breath was advancing or bogged down, whether salvation was approaching, or whether they should prepare for a different fate entirely. In the pocket itself, hope and despair existed in strange equilibrium. Each rumour that the relief column was close raised morale enough to sustain men through another night of rationing and cold. Each silent hour that passed without the sound of relieving artillery raised the possibility that no relief was coming at all. The prisoner's dilemma of psychology. Hope might give strength enough to survive, but false hope would make the eventual collapse all the more devastating. The terrain Breath had to cross was deceptive in its emptiness. The Ukrainian steppe in winter appears almost abstract, a kind of white nothingness that seems as though nothing could possibly impede movement across it. Yet this flatness was precisely what made it so difficult. There were no natural features to provide cover or concealment, which meant that any advancing column was visible from immense distances. The Soviets could position their anti-tank guns and massed artillery with full knowledge of where the Germans would have to pass. It was like watching someone cross an open meadow, where every step has been pre-calculated and prepared against. The cold itself became a tactical problem. Vehicles that moved too quickly across snow could break through the frozen crust and become bogged. Vehicles that moved too slowly invited concentrated Soviet fire. Breath and his officers had to find some rhythm between speed and caution, and the rhythm they found was often too slow to suit the pressing urgency of the situation. By January 28th, after 2 days of grinding advance, Breath's force had pushed perhaps 30 kilometers into the Soviet positions, but they had not yet reached the pocket itself, and their losses were accumulating. The casualty figures from this period are imprecise. Records were chaotic, and units filing their reports weeks later sometimes reconstructed numbers from memory rather than contemporary documentation, but it is clear that for every kilometer gained, the relief column was bleeding away men and vehicles. Fuel consumption was extraordinary in the cold. Diesel fuel thickened, engines labored, and the normal consumption rates calculated for temperate climates became academic fictions. Breath was beginning to face not only enemy fire, but the physics of logistics in winter warfare. His supply lines stretched back through the snow, vulnerable to Soviet interdiction, and there was a growing sense among his officers that the relief column itself might become a second encircled force if they pushed too far forward without securing their flanks and rear. Was this thought, the fear of becoming trapped while attempting to rescue the trapped, something that kept Breath's men awake in the cold nights? The attempts to push through Soviet lines met with increasing ferocity as the relief column moved closer to the pocket. The Soviets committed reserves specifically to stop Breath's advance, positioning them not necessarily to destroy his force entirely, but simply to delay it, to hold him far enough away from the pocket that the trapped Germans would have no choice but to attempt their own breakout. In this sense, the Soviet strategy was working perfectly. The relief attempt, by its very existence, was forcing the Germans in the pocket to prepare for what they would eventually have to do anyway, which was to fight their way out on their own rather than sit passively and wait to be relieved. There was a cruel logic to this. The relief attempt, without actually achieving relief, was making breakout inevitable. What might have seemed like salvation from a distance was becoming, in actuality, a pressure that would force men into the open snow and across frozen rivers, with Soviet artillery following their every step. By the end of January, as the thaw began to complicate the situation further, Breath's 3 Panzer Corps had pushed as far as they could reasonably advance without being entirely consumed by the Soviet counterattack. They had penetrated the outer ring of the encirclement, but they had not broken through to the pocket, and the window of opportunity was closing. The snow that had defined the landscape for weeks was beginning to soften at its edges, and within days it would transform into mud so profound that movement would become nearly impossible for any vehicle heavier than a man could carry. The relief attempt, in its own way, had succeeded precisely by failing. It had proven that no quick rescue was possible, and it had proven that the only option left to the trapped Germans was to break out toward the relief force, meeting it somewhere in the snow-covered void between the pocket and the German lines, and hope that in the collision of those two forces, enough men would survive to reach actual safety. And yet, even as the men inside the pocket arranged themselves into defensive positions, even as Breath's panzers ground forward through snow and frozen ruts in their desperate race from the west, nature itself was preparing to betray them all. For in late January on the Ukrainian steppe, the weather does not remain a constant adversary. It shifts, it breathes, and sometimes, paradoxically, a thaw can be far more destructive than the deepest frost. The winter of 1944 had been severe. That much the historical record makes perfectly clear. The soldiers trapped within the Cherkassy Pocket spoke of temperatures that plunged to -20, -25 degrees Celsius on the worst nights. The cold was so complete, so all-consuming, that it had become almost a familiar companion, a known threat one could measure and plan against. Ice formed on rifle mechanisms. Engines had to be kept running, or they would not start again. Water froze in the canteens of men, and the frost burned exposed skin within minutes. Horses died by the hundreds, their breath crystallizing in clouds above their bodies, and their meat, what remained of it, had to be rationed carefully among the starving troops. But beginning in the last week of January, something began to change in the atmosphere. A wind came from the south and west, carrying with it a subtle warmth. The temperature rose, not dramatically. We are not speaking of spring breaking suddenly upon the steppe, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to transform the landscape in ways that would prove catastrophic for the relief operation attempting to reach the trapped men. The roads, you see, across the Ukrainian winter, are a peculiar and terrible thing. When the ground is frozen solid, they become passable for armored vehicles and truck columns, provided the fuel holds and the engines remain functional. But the moment that deep permafrost begins to soften, the moment the surface thaw sets in, those same roads transform into something almost alive with mud. It is not quite liquid, not quite solid. It is a kind of grey, clinging slurry that grabs at wheels and treads with almost sentient persistence. Imagine tar that has not fully hardened, and you begin to approach the reality of it. General Breath and his 3 Panzer Corps were experiencing this transformation in the most brutal possible terms. His advance from the southwest had already been slowed by Soviet resistance, and by the simple fact that his force was not large enough to break through the Soviet cordon with overwhelming force. The Soviets had anticipated his relief attempt, and they had positioned anti-tank guns and mechanized forces to contest every kilometer. But now, as the days passed and the temperature climbed, an even more implacable foe was working against him. The roads behind his columns, the supply lines that were meant to feed ammunition and fuel to his leading tanks and infantry, were beginning to dissolve into impassable mire. Picture the scene for a moment, if you will, not in triumph, but in the grinding reality of it. A German truck, laden with ammunition for the relief column, approaches a crossroads. The driver has been awake for perhaps 30 hours. The temperature has risen to barely above freezing, maybe -3 or 4 degrees. The road beneath him, which yesterday bore weight easily enough, is now soft. The wheels sink. They spin. The truck lurches forward a meter, then another meter, then begins to slow as the mud thickens around them. Behind him, other vehicles queue. The supply line, so vital to maintaining the breakthrough, is clogging like an artery. And within the pocket itself, this weather shift was being observed with a kind of grim fascination. The men knew what thaw meant. They understood, with an almost medieval clarity, that nature was not on anyone's side, certainly not on the side of relief or escape. The snow that had covered the pocket began to sink. The ice on the Gniloy Tikich River, which would later become so central to the story of the breakout, began to weaken at its edges. If the thaw continued, if it became profound enough, the crossing of that river would become not merely difficult, but potentially impossible. The ice upon which thousands of men would need to move, men already depleted by hunger and cold, already weakened by weeks of encirclement, might simply give way beneath their weight. There is something almost philosophical in contemplating how weather functions as a military force in such campaigns. Strategy, logistics, the concentration of firepower, the morale of the troops, all these things matter, certainly, but they all operate within a boundary set by the physical world. The same thaw that threatened to make rescue impossible for Breath also threatened to worsen the very trap that held the pocket. Mud slowed the rescuers. Mud and melting snow created an almost suction-like grip on anything with wheels or treads. The roads that connected the pocket to the relief force became less like roads and more like strips of adhesive spread across the landscape. And one might ask, as the soldiers within the pocket began to understand that rescue was becoming less likely by the hour, what did this weather shift do to their psychology? For weeks, they had endured the cold, yes, but the cold had at least been predictable. The cold had not changed its nature, but this thaw, this warming, which in different circumstances might have seemed like a mercy, a reprieve from the killing frost, it was being understood here, in this particular moment in history, as something closer to catastrophe. The hope that had been tentatively building as Breath's columns advanced was beginning to chill again, this time through an almost palpable despair. If even nature was turning against them, if the very ground beneath them was becoming an enemy, then what remained? The Soviet commanders, watching this same weather shift, were seeing something quite different. They were seeing an advantage. A thaw that slowed the German relief effort was a thaw that made the Soviet stranglehold on the pocket even more secure. Time, increasingly, belonged to them. And time, in warfare, is often measured not in hours of combat, but in how long the enemy can remain supplied, how long the will to resist can be sustained on diminishing rations and in circumstances of deepening isolation. So the weather turned, and the mud spread across the Ukrainian steppe, and in the offices in Moscow, in the command posts of the advancing German relief columns, in the dugouts and bunkers within the pocket itself, men began to recalibrate their understanding of what was possible. The breakout, which had seemed something that would perhaps be undertaken soon, began to look less like a choice and more like an inevitability, racing toward them through time and through thaw and through the slow, patient work of armies gathering their strength. By the first week of February, the mathematics of survival had become impossible to ignore. Inside the pocket, what remained of 2 German corps, perhaps 90,000 men at the outset, though the numbers grew murkier with each passing day, faced a choice that no amount of faith in Hitler's distant will could any longer postpone. The relief column under Breath had stalled. The thaw, that cruelest turn of fortune on the Eastern Front, had transformed the roads into rivers of mud that swallowed vehicles whole, that turned every advance into a crawl, measured in hundreds of meters rather than miles, and within the pocket itself, the circle was tightening. Soviet guns had begun to reach the very heart of what had been the German position, their shells landing now on areas that had seemed, only days before, to offer some small sanctuary. The commanders trapped inside knew, though few would say it aloud in those first hours, that standing fast was no longer a strategy. It was a funeral march conducted with ceremonial precision. General Wilhelm Stemmermann, who held operational command of the pocket, was a professional soldier of the old Prussian school, trained to obey orders from above and to shoulder the weight of those orders without question. Yet even he could calculate what the others could calculate. The horses were dying. The wounded filled every barn and makeshift shelter, their infections spreading in the bitter cold, their morphine running low. The rations had dwindled to portions that seemed designed not to sustain, but merely to delay the inevitable. And the men themselves, the infantry, the tank crews, the support troops, were reaching that threshold where hunger and cold and the constant concussive trauma of artillery fire begin to wear away not just the body, but something deeper, something that might be called the will to endure without purpose. Around him, other voices began to gather weight. The divisional commanders, those steady professionals who had somehow kept discipline and cohesion alive through weeks of encirclement, began to speak more openly about what had perhaps been obvious for days. What if the pocket could move? What if, instead of waiting for rescue that was not coming, the trapped forces themselves became the rescuing force, breaking through the Soviet lines toward the relief column, or better still, toward the main German front further west? It was not mutiny. It was not even quite disobedience, though it would come to resemble both as the hours passed. It was rather the moment when professional military judgment began to quietly override the absolute dictates from Berlin. Perhaps it began with a question asked almost casually: what if we simply moved? And perhaps once that question was asked, once it was allowed to hang in the frozen air of a command post, it could not be unasked. The Waffen-SS Viking division, those Nordic volunteers and their attached German cadres, had already proven themselves capable of discipline under extraordinary stress. They had held their sector of the pocket's perimeter with a kind of fanatical steadiness, driven by ideological conviction that kept them functioning even as ordinary soldiers around them began to lose coherence. Might they not also serve as the spearhead of a breakout? Might their very commitment to the National Socialist cause, which had seemed so abstract and distant when standing fast in the cold, now be channeled towards something concrete, towards survival through action? The Soviet positions surrounding the pocket were not impenetrable, though they were formidable. Soviet armies, for all their recent successes and their material abundance, were also stretched thin across vast distances. The encirclement had been achieved through aggressive maneuver and overwhelming numerical superiority, but maintaining a blockade in winter across an area measuring some 30 kilometers in diameter required constant vigilance and the stationing of troops who were themselves exhausted and cold-worn. Was there a seam in that blockade, a weakness through which trained, desperate men might force their way? It would be wrong to suggest that the decision to break out arrived all at once, like a thunderbolt. Rather, It accumulated over several days, hardening from speculation into something resembling consensus. Berlin did not approve it. Berlin was still issuing stand-fast orders, still promising that relief was imminent, still operating according to a map of intentions rather than a map of facts. But Berlin was 500 kilometers away. Berlin did not see the horses lying dead in the streets. Berlin did not hear the sounds coming from the field hospitals. Berlin did not have to look into the eyes of 19-year-old conscripts and explain why they should continue to do so when death was approaching incrementally from two directions. Somewhere in this gathering resolve, there was also something that might be called hope, though it was a fragile and conditional thing. If the pocket could move as a force, if it could achieve surprise, if the Soviet cordon could be breached at a chosen point, if weather held or turned to their advantage, if the relief column could coordinate its movements from outside, then perhaps not all would be lost. Perhaps a substantial portion of these 90,000 men could reach friendly lines. Perhaps some core of organized resistance could be preserved to fight another day. Perhaps, after all, the encirclement would not become a complete annihilation. This hope was not irrational. It was based on real military calculations, on terrain, on the dispersion of Soviet forces, on the knowledge of where German lines actually lay, on the possibility of force concentration at a chosen point to overwhelm a section of the encircling perimeter. But it was also, in some profound sense, an act of faith. Faith that discipline could be maintained during a chaotic night march. Faith that the columns would not simply dissolve into panic and dissolution as soon as the Soviet guns opened fire in the darkness. Faith that men exhausted and hungry and traumatized would follow orders into the unknown, trusting in their commanders and in the possibility that movement itself might somehow alter the equation of their fate. By the evening of February 10th, the decision had effectively been made, though it would take another night and half a day to prepare. The stand-fast order from Hitler would be superseded by a more pressing logic, the logic of practical survival. The breakout would happen. The pocket, which had been static and shrinking, would transform into a moving force hurling itself against the Soviet lines. What would happen then, no one could truly know. The decision had come down from the fractured command structure in the last hours of January 28th, a quiet reversal of Hitler's stand-fast order that had seemed, until then, immutable as winter itself. The men in the pocket had learned by then that orders from Berlin were written in a world that bore no resemblance to the frozen mud beneath their feet, and so when word filtered through the collapsing communication lines that they would attempt to break out toward General Breith's relief forces, there was no celebration, only a kind of exhausted understanding that staying would mean slower death, and moving at least meant the possibility of survival, however remote. As darkness settled across the steppe on that last night, the temperature dropping further into the dangerous reaches that made breath painful and water freeze in canteens before it could be drunk, a strange work began across the pocket. It was the labor of men preparing their own erasure, a deliberate unmaking of everything that could not be carried across the open snow. Vehicles that had been nursed along on cannibalized parts and stubborn will were drained of fuel and rendered immobile, their engines methodically destroyed so they would not fall intact to the Soviets. The sound of hammers and explosives was muted by the snow and the night, but it carried a finality that every man could feel in his chest. Guns that could not be transported were spiked, their mechanisms destroyed, their barrels bent or filled with mud and then refrozen. Ammunition that could not be carried was buried or burned. Maps were burned, code books were burned. Anything that might tell the enemy about German positions, strengths, or intentions was systematically reduced to ash or scattered across the drifts. There was almost no fire visible across the pocket, because fire meant death from Soviet artillery, and so most of this destruction happened in darkness, guided by touch and habit, and the pale luminescence of snow under stars. Men worked with numb fingers. Some had already begun losing feeling in their hands and feet, and they bound their fingers with cloth in ways they had learned from the Russian winter, crossing their arms across their chests in a posture that looked almost like an embrace. The temperature that night was perhaps 15 degrees below 0 Celsius, though no one was recording such details anymore. The chronometers and measurements of the command structure had become irrelevant. Survival kept its own time. The horses presented a particular anguish that few voices would speak of openly. The German army, despite its reputation for mechanical modernity, still relied on horses in vast numbers, and the pocket held several thousand of these animals, most of them barely alive, their ribs visible through dull coats, their eyes sunken, their breath steaming in the brutal cold. Some had already begun to die of starvation. Others stood in near catatonic stupor, indifferent to their suffering. The orders that came regarding the horses were understood without being stated directly. They could not be moved at pace across open ground, and they could not be left for the Soviets. In the darkness, in small groups away from the main positions, this grim work was carried out. It is difficult to know with certainty what emotions moved through the men as they did this, though those who survived, and later wrote about the pocket, spoke of a kind of numbness, a compartmentalization of conscience that war imposes on soldiers. The horses had been companions through months of campaign. They had known the faces of their handlers, and now they had to be left behind. The wounded represented an even more agonizing calculation. In the makeshift hospitals that had been established in barns, schoolhouses, and commandeered buildings across the shrinking perimeter, there were perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 men who could not walk, many of whom could not be moved without causing death, and virtually all of whom would certainly die if they were abandoned. But they could not be carried across open snowfields under artillery fire. The mathematics of triage had been pushed to its brutal limit. Medical officers made their rounds in the grey-lit darkness, making decisions that would haunt them, if they survived, for the rest of their lives. Some of the more severely wounded were given morphine and left in the care of volunteers who would stay behind, men who knew they were almost certainly surrendering themselves to capture or death, but who made the choice to remain with their comrades. It is one of the paradoxes of war that such profound kindness exists alongside industrial-scale cruelty, and those who witnessed these moments in the Cherkassy Pocket spoke of them with a kind of reverent sorrow. The walking wounded, those who could move if supported, were being prepared for the crossing. They were bandaged as best the available supplies allowed. Frostbite wounds were wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared. Infections that had begun to fester during the encirclement were left largely untreated, because antibiotics had run out days ago. Men who had been shot, burned, frozen and starved were being told to gather what strength remained and prepare to march. Some drank what little alcohol could be found, not for courage, but for the brief warmth it provided, before the cold reasserted itself even more intensely. Others sat in silence, looking at photographs of homes they might never see again, or perhaps not looking at anything at all, their minds having retreated to some interior space where the Polish winter could not reach. The units reorganized themselves in the darkness with a quiet efficiency that spoke to their training and their desperation. The SS Wiking Division, which had come to hold a sector of the perimeter, was moving into position as one of the spearheads of the breakout. These men, Nordic volunteers, Estonian and Ukrainian recruits, career soldiers and conscripts, and ideological true believers all mixed together, were understanding that they would likely be among the first through the Soviet lines, which meant they would likely experience the heaviest fire. The command structure for the breakout was being finalized. Priorities were being set. Which units would move first, which would follow, which would hold the rear. These were not abstract military questions. These were decisions about whose men would be most likely to survive the next 24 hours. A kind of stillness descended as the night deepened. In the frozen trenches and dugouts, men lay close together for warmth, though sleep was nearly impossible. Some whispered to neighbors, perhaps saying things they thought they might not get another chance to say. Others lay in absolute silence. Somewhere across the darkness, a voice was singing very quietly, a German folk song, something about home and seasons and peace. It cut off abruptly, perhaps because the singer became aware of what he was doing, perhaps for some other reason. The snow fell softly. The wind moved across the steppe in gusts that made the cold seem almost alive, almost sentient in its cruelty. In a few hours, the artillery would begin, the columns would form, the long walk across the open ground would start. But for now, in these last hours of the pocket's existence as a defined place, there was a profound and terrible quiet, broken only by the sound of wind and the small, urgent preparations of men who had accepted that their old world was ending and that they would have to move into the new one or die. The decision had been made in those final hours before midnight, when the pocket's command realized that waiting for relief was no longer a choice they possessed. The columns were formed in what darkness the winter night could offer, though darkness on the Ukrainian steppe in late February is never truly complete. Snow reflects starlight. Snow amplifies sound. The men who gathered in their units that evening understood, perhaps without being told, that the next hours would determine who among them would see spring. They began to move across the open snowfields toward the west and northwest, where German lines lay somewhere beyond the Soviet cordon. The temperature had begun to climb again. The thaw was coming, which meant the roads would turn to mud, which meant they had to move now, while the frozen ground still held their weight. Perhaps this was the only mercy of their circumstances. The weather window closing on them like a tightening fist also closed on the Soviet ability to maneuver heavy armor behind them. The columns stretched across the white expanse in loose formation, companies and battalions moving in a direction they had been given, following officers who had studied the maps and the satellite photographs made from observation balloons days before. There was no true secrecy anymore. The Soviets knew they were coming. The question was only how many would break through, and at what cost to themselves, and to the forces arrayed against them. As the first elements of the vanguard moved into the open, the Soviet artillery began. This was not unexpected, but expectation does little to prepare a man for the moment when earth erupts around him, and the night suddenly fills with light and sound, and the smell of cordite mixing with the iron-cold air. The shells fell in patterns that suggested coordination, that somewhere in command posts behind Soviet lines, officers were watching and adjusting fire, calling out corrections, sending waves of destruction into the moving columns. The Waffen-SS Viking Division formed part of the breakout force, their men interspersed with Wehrmacht units and elements of other formations in a deliberate mixing of resources and command. This too was calculated. The Waffen-SS, for all the mythology and ideology that surrounded them, were experienced soldiers in winter warfare, men who had fought on the Eastern Front since the invasion of the Soviet Union, who understood the rhythm of snow and cold and how to move through it without becoming statues for the enemy. Some of the volunteers in their ranks had come from Scandinavia, from the Baltic states, from occupied territories and, in some cases, from regions where they had no business being, but had come anyway, drawn by politics or necessity or both. The artillery fire did not stop as the columns advanced. Instead, it seemed to intensify, rolling across the steppe in a methodical pattern that suggested the Soviets were not simply trying to destroy them, but were attempting to channel them, to force them into killing zones where flanking fire could decimate them further. One might wonder, in the darkness and cold, whether this was the systematic application of military science, or whether the officers directing the fire were simply determined that no German soldier should leave this pocket alive. In reality, it was likely both, though one did not necessarily contradict the other in the minds of commanders who had seen the German invasion and its horrors, and who had sworn to push every invader back across Soviet territory. The columns began to experience the first significant casualties within the first kilometers of movement. Men fell in the snow, some struck by fragments of shell, others simply collapsing from the shock and exhaustion of moving through shell fire, the adrenaline keeping them upright only until the next moment when their legs simply refused to continue. There were stretchers made from equipment, from blankets tied to rifle barrels, but there were far more wounded than anyone had anticipated, or perhaps the anticipation had been so dark that reality seemed somehow more bearable than the waiting had been. The flanking fire came as the columns began to extend across the snowfields. This suggested that the Soviets had positioned forces not only to their front, but along the routes they had calculated the breakout would follow. This too had been anticipated, at least by the command staff, who had tried to position their own flank guards and screening elements to deal with this contingency. What can be anticipated on a map in a warm headquarters, however, often meets a different reception when executed in darkness and cold by men who are exhausted and hungry and increasingly aware of their mortality. Some of the soldiers moving through the snow that night were conscripts, men who had been swept up in the conscription drives of the Wehrmacht and had never chosen to be soldiers, let alone trapped soldiers. Others were volunteers, ideologically committed or, in some cases, men who had volunteered because remaining in civilian life under German occupation had offered no real choice. The Waffen-SS volunteers from the Nordic countries and the Baltic states fell into the latter category mostly, though not universally. Men's motivations are rarely simple, and war makes them even more complex. The snowfields themselves, which had seemed like protection earlier in the campaign, began to feel like a liability now. The open ground offered no shelter, no cover from the artillery, except the simple mathematical randomness of shell placement. The columns had to spread out to avoid presenting a concentrated target, but spreading out meant that units lost visual contact with each other, that the coherence of the breakout began to fragment almost immediately. Officers moved between units on horseback or on foot, trying to maintain some semblance of direction, trying to keep men moving toward the invisible line where German forces held positions and safety existed, or at least the possibility of safety. The night deepened rather than lightened, as often happens in late winter in Eastern Europe. The sky should have been growing lighter in the east as the hours moved toward dawn, but instead, the snow clouds thickened, and the temperature, which had seemed to be moderating, began to drop again. This atmospheric shift would prove significant. It would keep the roads harder, longer. It would also, however, reduce visibility for both the attacking and defending forces, which meant that some of the soldiers moving through the columns that night would simply lose each other in the darkness and the snow, and the question of what happened to them would occupy historians and families for decades to come. The Soviet artillery continued its methodical work, and the flanking fire continued to rake the columns from the sides. The men who survived the first hour of the breakout began to move faster, not because they were told to, but because the simple calculus of survival suggested that speed, even exhausted speed, was preferable to remaining still. The horses that had survived the siege, the few that remained from the pocket's transport and supply elements, began to stumble as they moved across the broken snow, their hooves finding unexpected hollows, their tired frames struggling under loads they could no longer comfortably carry. One might pause here, in the flow of this narrative, and consider what it meant for these soldiers, men of the Waffen-SS and the Wehrmacht, men of the Walloon Brigade and other volunteer formations, to move through the darkness toward an uncertain outcome. The ideological differences that had defined their positions before encirclement seemed to matter less in the snow. The cold does not discriminate between volunteers and conscripts, between ideological soldiers and reluctant ones. It simply takes what it can take and demands of those who remain a kind of animal persistence that overrides the intellectual frameworks within which they might have previously understood their service. The breakout was succeeding, in the most basic sense. The columns were moving. The perimeter was being broken. The thousands of men who had been trapped in the pocket were beginning to flow out of it like water through a crack in ice, and though many of them would not survive the next hours, the mere fact of movement, of escape from the tightening noose, seemed to lend a strange kind of hope to those who experienced it. Behind them, in the pocket itself, other units and support elements continued to organize rearguard actions, to slow the Soviet advance, to buy time for the main breakout columns to open the distance between themselves and their pursuers. The columns moved through the darkness and across the snow, and each kilometer they traveled seemed to cost them something. A man here, a horse there, the coherence of formation, the sense of belonging to a unit. But each kilometer also brought them closer to the western horizon, closer to the lines where other German soldiers waited, closer to the possibility of having survived this catastrophic encirclement. Whether survival would lead to anything resembling safety or peace was a question that no one in those columns was asking themselves. For now, the only question was whether the next shell would have your name on it, or whether you would see the next hour, and whether the men around you would continue moving forward, or whether they would stop and become part of the great white expanse that was slowly absorbing the battle and making it its own. The river that stood between the trapped men and safety was called the Gniloy Tikich, a name that carries in its Cyrillic syllables something of the cold that awaited those who would cross it. In the Ukrainian language, Gniloy suggests rot, decay, something rank and corrupted, and in those first moments of the breakout, as the columns pressed toward that waterway through the darkness and the artillery fire, the river itself seemed to embody the very principle of their undoing. The ice beneath it, formed week after week in the harsh winter, was beginning to fracture and weaken as temperatures that January night hung in that precarious zone between freezing and thaw. Some stretches held firm and solid, others were betraying those who trusted them. The German columns converged on the crossing points under a constant, almost theatrical bombardment. Soviet gunners, positioned on the surrounding heights, could see the dark masses of men and horses and vehicles moving through the snow, and they concentrated their fire with the knowledge that this was the moment of greatest vulnerability. The Wehrmacht engineers, who had done what they could to prepare crossing points, had established gaps in the ice and laid what materials they possessed. But there was never enough, never enough. Everything was happening too quickly, with not enough light, not enough coordination, not enough certainty that the plan would hold. The horses went first, sometimes, driven into the water to test its strength. These were not the sleek cavalry mounts of an earlier era, but exhausted draft animals, broken down by weeks of pulling overloaded sleds and wagons across frozen ground. Many were already half-starved, many bore wounds. When they struck the ice at the river's edge, and the water began to pull at their legs, some of them simply stopped moving forward, as if some animal instinct told them that the passage ahead led to dissolution. Soldiers with rifles' butts drove them on, or they were shot where they stood, and their bodies sometimes became obstacles that others had to navigate around, dark shapes half submerged in the black water. The men who followed waded into the current with a slowness that speaks to the shock of such cold, that moment when immersion in water near freezing acts upon the human body not as a sensation, but as a kind of sudden, absolute betrayal. Breath catches. The limbs seem to separate from conscious control. Can you imagine the precise moment when a soldier, already weakened by weeks of near starvation within the pocket, his boots already worn through in places, steps from the relative shelter of the ice into water so cold that it seems to rewrite the rules of what a human being can endure? The crossing points were narrow, necessarily so, which meant that men crowded together, pressed against one another, and when someone faltered or fell, those behind had nowhere to move but forward, over them sometimes, or to the side into deeper water. The vehicles presented their own arithmetic of tragedy. Some tracked vehicles could navigate the crossing if the ice held beneath their weight. Trucks and half-tracks, heavy with ammunition and wounded, pushed through with their drivers half-blind in the darkness, guided by men with flashlights, who themselves were targets for Soviet snipers. How many drivers made it across? How many felt the vehicle suddenly shift and tilt as the ice gave way beneath them, the front wheels dropping into open water, the engine still running, diesel fumes rising in the frozen air? The men inside, if they were awake and aware, had perhaps seconds to scramble out, assuming they were not injured, assuming they were not already hypothermic and slow in their movements. The account that emerges from the various regimental records and survivor testimonies paints a picture of the crossing that defies easy summary. Some units moved across in good order, their units intact, their soldiers supporting one another. Other sections of the crossing dissolved into something closer to panic, though even amid that chaos, there were moments of discipline reasserting itself. officers and non-commissioned officers calling out commands, trying to keep their men moving forward rather than clustering in deadly masses at the water's edge. The Waffen-SS units, including elements of the Wiking Division, had specific responsibilities for the crossing and for holding rear positions to provide covering fire for those ahead. Many of these men were hardened soldiers, accustomed to combat, but the Gniloy Tikich presented a form of ordeal that no amount of training truly prepares the human frame for. The cold itself becomes a character in this crossing, a presence that observers report with a kind of awe. It was not the extreme cold of the early weeks of winter, when temperatures dropped to 20 or 30 degrees below freezing. This was different, perhaps a few degrees below 0 Celsius, made worse by the wind that moved across the open river valley and by the exertion of the crossing itself. Men who made it across and were interviewed later spoke of the sensation of ice forming on their uniforms almost immediately upon emerging from the water, the wet cloth hardening in the air, becoming armor of a sort, though armor that transmitted cold directly into the body. How does a soldier keep walking, keep moving toward distant fires that might mean warmth and safety, when every muscle is locked in cold, when the mind begins to fog with the onset of hypothermia? The crossing took hours. Different units reached the river at different times, and the window of opportunity was itself closing as the Soviet forces began to tighten their perimeter, sensing that this was the moment when the pocket might break open. Some accounts suggest that the heaviest casualties occurred not in the immediate vicinity of the river itself, but in the mile or two beyond it, where exhausted men, their uniforms partially frozen, their bodies beginning the shutting down process of terminal hypothermia, were caught in open ground with nowhere to shelter, and Soviet artillery and machine gun fire continuing to fall. A soldier could survive the river itself, could emerge on the far bank and keep moving, and yet still not survive the night. Among the units that crossed, the Wiking Division maintained elements on the far bank as a rearguard, soldiers selected to stay behind just long enough to ensure that stragglers could still cross, that the withdrawing columns had some covering fire to hold off Soviet pursuit. These men, understanding that they would be among the last to cross, that they were, in some sense, sacrificing their own safety margin for those ahead, went about their preparations with a quietness that speaks to something deeper than fear. They were, many of them, ideological volunteers, men who had come from across occupied Europe and beyond to serve in the SS. But in these final hours before their own crossing, ideology seems to have mattered less than the simple solidarity of shared ordeal, the unspoken agreement among men in extremis that survival depended on maintaining some thread of cohesion. When these rearguard elements finally began their own crossing, the night was shifting toward dawn. The visibility was improving, which meant that Soviet gunners could see their targets more clearly, but it also meant that the exhausted men crossing could at least see where they were placing their feet, could try to avoid the bodies and the wreckage that now studded the ice and the far bank. Some of these men would make it across, others would not. The water would take them, or the cold, or the persistent artillery fire that seemed to follow every group that attempted the passage. There is a passage in at least one survivor account that describes the river bottom at the crossing point, the way that frozen feet and bodies had begun to create an almost macabre landscape beneath the surface, visible through the clear ice in places, a reminder that every person ahead had paid the price of passage, with cold and fear, if not with death. The ice beneath the river had begun to crack in earnest now, great jagged fissures spreading like veins across the surface as thousands of men pressed forward into the Gniloy Tikich. Behind them, the darkness seemed almost solid with the sound of pursuit, artillery fire punctuating the night, searchlights sweeping across the white expanse in wild, violent arcs. And yet, across that freezing water, there emerged a curious discipline, a deliberate geometry of organization, even as chaos threatened to consume everything. The Wiking Division, that assembly of Nordic volunteers and German regulars who had fought through so many campaigns across the immensity of Russia, found themselves positioned precisely where such organization mattered most, At the rearguard, the thin human barrier between the retreating columns and the Soviet forces pressing ever closer. They had been selected for this terrible duty, not by random chance but by calculation. They were among the most experienced troops in the pocket, men who had survived previous encirclements, who understood the mechanics of withdrawal under fire. And so they held the southern bank of the Gniloy Tikich, creating what one might imagine as a fragile dam of human bodies and disciplined fire, buying minutes for the hundreds still struggling through the water ahead. Officers and non-commissioned officers moved among the men with a kind of quiet insistence, voices kept low even as shells fell all around. We might wonder, drifting through this scene, how such calm authority persists when everything is fracturing, when the very purpose of military structure, to protect those beneath it, seems to have become impossible. Yet it did persist, at least for a time. Positions were maintained. Fire was controlled and directed rather than panicked. Machine gunners kept their weapons trained on the Soviet approaches, rationing ammunition not from certainty that supply would return, but from the simple knowledge that when the bullets ended, so too would their ability to hold even this narrow strip of frozen riverbank. The temperature had fallen further as the night deepened, perhaps to 20 degrees below zero, or colder still, and men were beginning to suffer wounds that had nothing to do with bullets. Frostbite was claiming fingers and toes among soldiers who had already given everything their bodies possessed. There is a particular form of endurance required in such circumstances, one that goes beyond the usual calculus of military courage. It is the endurance of maintaining formation when dissolution would be easier, of remembering that one's life is less important in this moment than the collective task of survival for those who might escape. Runners moved between positions, carrying orders in whispered fragments. Hold. Do not yield. Prepare to withdraw to the next position. The Wiking Division's commander and his officers had to balance two impossible necessities simultaneously. They had to hold long enough for the main body to cross, yet they could not hold so long that they themselves would be cut off and surrounded. It was a calculation measured in minutes, in the time it took another 100 men to wade through water that was already filled with the bodies of those who had slipped and drowned, with equipment abandoned or lost, with the detritus of an army attempting to resurrect itself through sheer force of will. What we might observe, if we could stand invisible in that frozen darkness, is something peculiar to German military culture of that era. Even in the midst of what amounted to a managed catastrophe, there was an almost obsessive attention to hierarchy and order. Officers remained visible, moved with deliberation, gave orders that were obeyed because the men had internalized over years of service that obedience in such moments was itself a form of survival. It was not enthusiasm or ideological fervor that kept them in position. It was something deeper and more human, the habits of discipline, the weight of responsibility to those you had trained with and fought alongside, the understanding that to break formation was to invite not just personal annihilation, but the collapse of everyone behind you, still struggling through that river of ice. The Wiking Division held 3 positions that night along the southern bank, each one briefly occupied, each one briefly abandoned as the pressure intensified and the window of escape continued to narrow. Each withdrawal was covered by the position behind, creating a sequence of overlapping fields of fire that made enemy pursuit costly and deliberate rather than overwhelming. This was rearguard action at its most essential, not heroic in any glamorous sense, but grimly, coldly practical. How many men did they lose? Perhaps 50, perhaps more, perhaps less. The records of that night were never completed with precision. Death in such circumstances is often uncounted, absorbed into the collective loss, rather than tallied with individual names. There is something that occurs in men when they have agreed, consciously or otherwise, that their moment has come, that they will likely not survive the night, and yet they continue to function as if survival remains possible. It is not a paradox so much as a peculiar form of grace, a suspension of the mind that allows the body and the training to continue their work. The Wiking Division's rearguard actions across the Gniloy Tikich represent this condition in perhaps its purest form. These were men who had volunteered, years earlier, to join an organization that had become synonymous with atrocity, and yet here they were, performing acts of tactical brilliance and personal sacrifice that existed in no propaganda film, that would be known only to those who survived, or to later historians picking through fragmentary accounts. The river crossing continued through the deepening hours of darkness, thousands of men passing through a killing zone, and behind them, the Wiking Division's discipline held like a thread made of steel and frozen bone. When at last the final order came to withdraw, to cease holding, and to make their own crossing, they moved with the same precision they had maintained all through the night. Officers ensured no man was left behind, unless already beyond help. Weapons were carried when possible, abandoned only as a final resort. And then they too entered the water, their uniforms immediately beginning to stiffen as the cold took hold, their eyes fixed on the dim shapes of the German lines ahead. The columns broke apart almost immediately once they crossed the first stretch of open ground. The order and discipline that command had tried to impose in those final hours before dawn simply dissolved into the white expanse, scattered by Soviet shell fire and the fundamental chaos of thousands of exhausted men trying to move across snow in darkness under fire. Small groups formed and reformed as soldiers found themselves separated from their units, often by no more than a few meters of blowing snow, yet unable to locate one another again in the murk. A panzer grenadier might find himself walking alongside men from a completely different division, men whose insignia he could barely make out through the frozen crust on their uniforms, and these chance gatherings became temporary families, bound by proximity rather than command structure. The breakout zone itself became a kind of fractured geography. There was no clear front line in the conventional sense, no neat trench system where one side ended and another began. Instead, there were Soviet positions scattered across hills and ridges, some held by infantry, others by cavalry units, that moved with predatory grace through the snow, and the darkness made it impossible to know where safety lay. A group of perhaps 30 men moving west might suddenly encounter muzzle flashes from 3 directions at once and scatter into the darkness, each soldier following instinct rather than orders, seeking the next fold in the ground, the next frozen stream bed that might offer concealment. These moments of contact were often brief and chaotic, a few minutes of intense fire followed by silence and separation, leaving soldiers uncertain whether they had driven the enemy away or simply stumbled upon a gap in the Soviet lines. What emerges from the accounts and testimonies of survivors is a picture not of organized withdrawal, but of fragments of organization, struggling to maintain coherence in an environment fundamentally hostile to order. Yet within that chaos there appeared, with surprising frequency, small acts of solidarity. A soldier who still possessed tobacco offered it to a man from another unit who had lost everything except his uniform and his rifle. An NCO, who might have otherwise been focused solely on keeping his own men moving, paused to help a straggler whose feet were so badly frozen that each step was an agony, supporting the man's weight and carrying his weapon. These gestures emerged not from ideology or doctrine but from something more primal, the recognition of shared suffering, the unspoken understanding that in conditions like these, a small kindness might be the difference between living through the night and not. The wounded presented their own terrible arithmetic. The pocket had included thousands of injured men, and the decision to attempt breakout rather than wait passively for relief meant that many of these soldiers had to be left behind, either in field hospitals or in buildings that could be hastily converted into aid stations. Some accounts suggest that medical personnel stayed with these patients, remaining in the pockets to provide what care they could, in the knowledge that they would almost certainly be captured. Other narratives, more painful still, describe wounded men being given morphine and left in rooms with a single armed soldier under orders to prevent them from wandering into Soviet hands. These were choices made at the edge of human experience, moments where military necessity collided with compassion and shattered both. Among the groups making their way across the breakout zone, water became as critical a concern as ammunition. Men's mouths and throats were parched despite the snow around them, and there was a widespread intuition, sometimes correct, sometimes tragically mistaken, that eating snow would only accelerate dehydration and death. Some soldiers carried canteens with traces of schnapps or coffee, and these became objects of quiet, desperate desire. A canteen passed from hand to hand among a small group of moving men represented not just fluid, but a momentary reminder of warmth, of life, beyond the immediate struggle for survival. The act of sharing became a small rebellion against the vast indifference of the steppe and cold. Horses, the great forgotten casualties of the Eastern Front, multiplied the suffering in ways that are often overlooked in written histories. There were still hundreds of them in the pocket, animals that had been struggling on inadequate rations for weeks, and as the breakout proceeded, men who had been marching for hours alongside these creatures made decisions about them that would haunt sleep for decades afterward. Some animals had to be shot to prevent them from slowing movement or from crying out and revealing positions to Soviet forces. Other horses simply collapsed on the snow, and the men marching past them often averted their eyes, unable to afford either the time to help or the emotional cost of witnessing the death of a companion. The sounds of these animals, the whinnying, the crashing as they fell, haunted the darkness more effectively than any weapon, a reminder that this breakout was not a clean operation, but a dissolution, a terrible unraveling of the entire structure of the pocket. Men went mad quietly in the breakout zone, or perhaps they went mad and expressed it quietly out of habit or residual discipline. There were soldiers who simply stopped moving, who sat down in the snow and refused to get up again, despite urgings and pleas from comrades. There were others who became convinced that the Soviet lines were ahead and turned to run the opposite direction, toward danger they imagined as more familiar. The cold itself seemed to affect perception, making distances impossible to gauge, making time move strangely. A 15-minute march felt like hours, a half hour of waiting felt like days. Darkness and exhaustion conspired to dissolve the boundary between what was real and what was hallucination. And yet within these fractured groups, a kind of grim humor persisted, or what might better be described as the dark irony that soldiers develop in extremity. Men joked, if it could be called joking, about their destinations, about whether they would reach German lines, or whether this was simply a longer way of dying. Gallows humor carried beneath jokes about hot food and clean uniforms, about mail waiting for them in towns they would never see. These moments of laughter, when they came, were brief and often immediately swallowed by the return to the grind of movement, of watching for muzzle flashes, of counting comrades and realizing someone was missing. The breakout zone was also a place where men encountered the Soviet forces in unexpected ways. There were soldiers who had surrendered to Soviet units and were being marched under guard back toward the rear, toward imprisonment. Some German soldiers reported seeing Soviet commanders holding their fire to allow groups to pass, whether from the impulses of mercy, from exhaustion, or from strategic calculations about the best way to manage the flow of escaping men. Other accounts describe Soviet units systematically destroying groups attempting to cross open ground, methodical and thorough. It is perhaps impossible to know with certainty how many such acts of restraint or fury occurred, and in the darkness and confusion of the breakout, perceptions became unreliable, stories shifted, and what a man experienced became entangled with what he heard had happened to others. The forward movement, such as it was, remained oriented toward the lines held by General Breith's relieving forces. This became the psychological anchor for many of the fleeing soldiers, the knowledge that somewhere to the west, German units were fighting their way in, that the breakout was not simply an escape into the vast emptiness of the steppe, but a movement toward friendly positions, toward something resembling safety. How much this knowledge sustained men versus how much it was a fiction they told themselves is a question that cannot be cleanly answered. Some soldiers who were interviewed in the days after the breakout reported that they had been aware only of moving away from Soviet fire, that they had no clear sense of which direction represented German lines, until they stumbled into them. Others spoke of an almost spiritual confidence that they would make it through, a certainty that seemed to carry them across distances that should have killed them. The mathematics of survival seemed to come down to luck, to small decisions made in moments of panic or clarity. A soldier who ducked into a ravine at the moment a flare illuminated the snow lived. One who kept moving did not. A man who chose to follow one group rather than another found himself on a path that led to German lines. His friend, who turned a different direction, disappeared into the darkness. Some of these differences can be explained by the tactical positions of Soviet forces, by terrain features, by the direction of the wind that carried the sounds of gunfire, but much of it simply cannot be explained, and survivors often spoke of this with a kind of bewildered humility, as though they were still processing their own escape as something verging on the miraculous. The first light that greeted those who had made it through the river was a pale, indifferent dawn, and it fell across a landscape of dispersed figures, moving with the deliberate slowness of men who had surrendered almost everything to forward motion. The Germans and their allies had poured across the Gniloy Tikich in waves throughout the long night, and now, in the grey minutes after moonset, they were moving through country that belonged neither entirely to the encircled nor to the relief forces waiting beyond. It was a space of profound uncertainty, where a man could see shadows that might have been rescuers or might have been Soviet patrols, and where the difference between salvation and capture sometimes rested on nothing more than the direction the wind was blowing the sound of engines. The pace of the breakout force had begun to quicken as dawn approached, not from hope exactly, but from the primal understanding that exposure to daylight in open country meant exposure to aircraft and to Soviet artillery that would range them with methodical ease. The columns were ragged by now, stretched across several miles of frozen and semi-frozen ground. There were men on foot who had abandoned their weapons after crossing the river, carrying nothing but the clothes on their bodies and the faint possibility that they might reach the German lines before their legs gave way entirely. There were soldiers still mounted, riding half-dead horses that moved in a kind of trance, their nostrils steaming in the sub-freezing air. There were wounded being carried on stretchers, improvised from greatcoats and rifle shafts, men whose silence as they were moved was perhaps more terrible than any cry. The relief forces under General Breath had pushed closer during the night, as the breakout was occurring, their own tanks grinding through the mud and snow in a race against the Soviet attempts to seal the pocket completely. They had suffered their own losses in this approach march, their own vehicles bogged and abandoned, their own men picked off by Soviet artillery fire that seemed to come from every direction at once. But they were there, waiting in the pre-dawn darkness, and they had instructions to gather in whoever came out. The first encounters between the breakout force and the relief elements were strangely quiet. There was no jubilation. The survivors were too exhausted, too emptied out by hunger and cold and fear, to feel anything as clear as joy. What happened in those hours after first contact was a kind of pastoral of the utterly spent. Men collapsed as soon as they reached what they perceived as safety, falling into the snow and simply remaining there, while medical orderlies and fellow soldiers tried to identify who was still alive and who might be revived with warmth, or with food that had not yet been issued. The supply trains that Breath had brought forward were barely adequate to the scale of what was emerging from the pocket. There were perhaps 40,000 men who had gotten across the river, though no one was quite certain of the number, even as they were being counted. The arithmetic of survival and loss was never clean in these moments, never truly knowable until days later, when the field hospitals had processed their patients and the casualty lists had been compiled by clerks working from incomplete rosters. The Waffen-SS Wiking Division, as a cohesive formation, had largely ceased to exist by the time its survivors reached the German lines. The division had gone into the pocket with a strength of something approaching 6,000 men, and perhaps 2/3 of that number emerged, though they were scattered among the general columns of the breakout, indistinguishable in appearance from the Wehrmacht soldiers around them, all of them equally filthy, equally starved, equally dazed by the transition from fight to rescue. The unit's command structure had fragmented. Divisional headquarters had been abandoned in the pocket itself, its files and its records burned to prevent their capture, a small act of denial against the reality of what was happening. The officers who survived were often junior men, lieutenants and sergeants, who had seen their companies collapse around them and who now found themselves responsible for shepherding small groups of their comrades toward the rear. The counting of survivors began in the hours after dawn, when brief staff attempted to process the flow of returning men and to determine how many had actually made it out of the pocket. The numbers that were being called forward, 40,000, perhaps 42,000, these were estimates based on incomplete observation. The Soviet forces, watching from a distance as the relief columns consolidated and began to move backward, were conducting their own arithmetic, and their numbers would later be quite different. This discrepancy in the accounting would become, in its own way, almost as consequential as the battle itself, because the narrative of what had happened at Cherkassy would be shaped by how many men were said to have been lost and how many to have been saved. The German records suggested that approximately 1,000 men had been killed in the breakout itself, particularly in the desperate passages across the Gniloy Tikich. Another 500 or so had been captured either during the crossing or in the hours after, as stragglers were picked up by Soviet patrols that were still combing the country even as the main relief force was withdrawing. The Wehrmacht's official count was that approximately 35,000 men had been rescued and returned to German lines. This figure was widely accepted in the immediate aftermath, recorded in operations reports, and transmitted up the chain of command to Army Group South and, eventually, to the High Command in Berlin, where it was used to construct a narrative of successful, if costly, extrication. The Soviet account was markedly different. The Soviet commands under Zhukov and Konev reported that they had inflicted catastrophic losses on the German forces, that the enemy had suffered perhaps 20,000 casualties in the fighting within the pocket, and perhaps another 5,000 during the breakout attempt. Their claims of captured men were higher than the German acknowledgement. They spoke of 8,000 to 10,000 prisoners taken in the operation overall. These figures, too, entered the Soviet record, and they too would be used to shape the narrative of Soviet success and German defeat, though in the Soviet case, the narrative was meant to illustrate the might of the Red Army in crushing the Nazi armies of occupation. What was the truth of the numbers? It is not possible to know with certainty even now, many decades later, after countless histories have been written and countless interviews conducted with the men who were there. The uncertainty springs from several sources. The chaos of the operation itself meant that no one was keeping careful track in real time. Units were fragmented, command structures were broken, and when officers attempted to make head counts in the hours after reaching safety, they were working with incomplete rosters, men's names misremembered or written incorrectly, men themselves uncertain of their own unit assignments. The German records were created in a state of mind that was not conducive to strict accuracy. Officers were trying to salvage what they could from a disaster and to present it in the best possible light. The Soviet records, similarly, were shaped by the propaganda requirements of the Soviet state and the desire to demonstrate the effectiveness of Soviet arms. What can be said, with reasonable confidence, is that somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 men emerged from the Cherkassy Pocket and made their way to German lines. It is likely that substantially fewer than 1,000 were killed in the breakout itself, though the suffering was immense. It is likely that several thousand were captured, perhaps fewer than the Soviet claims but more than the German acknowledgement. The remainder of the original encircled force, estimates suggest there were upward of 55,000 men trapped in the pocket initially, had either been killed in the defensive fighting that preceded the breakout or had been lost in the confusion of the crossing. Some had remained in the pocket, too wounded to move, left in the care of those few men who could not force themselves to abandon their comrades. The survivors themselves, in the hours after reaching German lines, were often too bewildered to contribute much to the arithmetic. They had been given a meal, typically a thin soup and a piece of dark bread, their first hot food in days. They had been arranged in columns for the withdrawal toward the rear, away from the front lines. The reality of having survived the pocket and the breakout was settling upon them like a physical weight. Some of them would later write accounts of what had happened, memories recorded in letters or in diaries, or in interviews conducted by military historians. These accounts would often differ in detail, but align in their essential structure: the hunger, the cold, the weight of encirclement, the desperate struggle across the river, and then the confusing, almost dreamlike experience of reaching safety. The psychological experience of survivors, in the hours and days after the breakout, was often one of numbness punctuated by sudden, sharp emotion. A man might sit in the back of a truck being driven toward the rear and find himself overcome, without warning, by tears or by a kind of hysterical laughter as the accumulated fear and exhaustion found release. Others entered a kind of stupor from which they had to be roused to eat or to move. Still others, perhaps the majority, occupied a middle state of awareness in which they functioned adequately but seemed to be observing their own actions from a distance. The medical staff attending to them recognized these signs as the natural responses of men who had endured extreme stress, and they did what they could to ease the transition from the desperate pace of survival to the slower pace of recovery. The immediate question that arose in the minds of the German High Command, as the casualty reports came in and the scale of the loss became apparent, was how this outcome would be presented to the German public, and, more importantly, how it would be explained to Adolf Hitler. The Führer had issued the stand-fast order that had led to the encirclement in the first place, and he had refused, at crucial moments, to authorize the breakout attempt that might have saved more lives. The successful extrication of 35,000 men could be presented as a triumph, a demonstration that even in the face of overwhelming Soviet pressure, German tactical skill and courage could achieve the seemingly impossible. It could also be presented, if one were inclined toward ruthless honesty, as the cost of Hitler's strategic miscalculation and his refusal to acknowledge the changing reality of the Eastern Front. The official narrative that would emerge would be closer to the first interpretation, though the second was never entirely absent from the consciousness of those officers who had overseen the operation. In the months and years that followed, as survivors scattered across a defeated and divided Germany, across Europe and into exile, the Cherkassy Pocket began its transformation from lived catastrophe into contested historical memory. The numbers themselves became a kind of battlefield, one fought not with artillery, but with documents, testimonies, and the slow accumulation of conflicting claims. How many men had been trapped inside those contracting lines? 40,000? 55,000? How many had broken through? How many had fallen on the frozen fields and in the icy river? How many had been lost to Soviet captivity, to cold, to hunger? The uncertainty was not merely academic. It touched on questions of competence, of sacrifice, of whether the escape had been a deliverance or a hollow survival bought at ruinous cost. The Wehrmacht's official accounts, compiled in the post-war years by officers seeking to preserve their institutional memory and often their personal reputations, tended toward the optimistic. German military historians and survivors' accounts frequently emphasized the successful breakthrough, the discipline maintained under fire, the audacity of the maneuver, the way trained soldiers had managed to extract themselves from what Soviet commanders had intended as an annihilation. These narratives often cited figures of 30 to 35,000 men reaching friendly lines, a number that lent weight to the idea that the operation, while costly, had been fundamentally successful. The Viking division in particular became associated with a kind of martial mythology in these tellings: Nordic warriors, foreign volunteers bound by shared ideology, holding the line against overwhelming odds, and then punching through the encirclement with characteristic aggression and tactical skill. The Soviet side of the historical record told a starkly different story, one rooted in the ideology of socialist realism and the communist state's need to demonstrate that Zhukov and Konev's grand strategy had crushed a German attempt at escape. Official Soviet accounts claimed far fewer breakouts, perhaps 10,000 men, perhaps fewer still, and emphasized instead the destruction of the trapped German forces, the enormous casualties inflicted, the victory of Soviet operational art over German tactical desperation. The Soviet narrative was designed to show the inevitable triumph of the Red Army, the futility of German resistance, and the correctness of the High Command's strategic vision. In this telling, the Cherkassy Pocket represented not a German escape, but a Soviet encirclement brought to its intended conclusion. The truth, as is so often the case with such contested events, lay fragmented across multiple testimonies and incomplete records. Post-war historical research, conducted with varying degrees of rigor by German, Soviet, and later Western and Russian scholars, began to converge on a more nuanced picture. Perhaps 35,000 men did break out. Neither the German claim of near-total success nor the Soviet insistence on near-total destruction. Perhaps 15,000 or more fell within the pocket or were captured in the chaos of withdrawal. The Soviet forces, despite their numerical superiority and their operational plan, had not achieved the complete annihilation they sought. Yet neither had the German escape been the clean tactical triumph that some Wehrmacht officers wanted it remembered as. It had been, instead, what most large-scale military disasters are: messy, costly, and ambiguous in its outcome. What complicated the picture further, and what made the Cherkassy Pocket such fertile ground for historical controversy, was the role of ideology in shaping how different groups remembered and recounted the event. For German military historians writing in the 1950s and 1960s, particularly those who had served in Wehrmacht units, there was often an unspoken pressure to portray their commanders and their units as professionally competent, even if strategically defeated by Soviet numbers and Hitler's disastrous grand strategy. The emphasis fell on tactical skill, on the courage of individual soldiers, on the impossible situation that even the most capable general could not overcome. This narrative served multiple purposes. It preserved the dignity of the military institution, it offered some redemption to men who had fought in a terrible cause, and it aligned with broader Western Cold War narratives that contrasted German military professionalism with Soviet brutality and ideological rigidity. Soviet historiography, by contrast, was bound by the requirements of communist state propaganda until well into the 1980s and even beyond. Soviet accounts of the Cherkassy Pocket had to fit into a larger story of inevitable Soviet victory, of the triumph of Marxist-Leninist ideology over fascism, of the genius of the Soviet High Command. Zhukov and Konev had to be seen as having succeeded completely or nearly so. The Soviet soldier had to be portrayed as brave, disciplined, and loyal to the state. Alternative narratives, uncertainty, or any suggestion that the German forces had managed a significant escape were discouraged or simply not published. When Soviet historians did conduct careful research into Cherkassy, and some did, with genuine scholarly rigor despite the constraints they worked under, their findings often remained confined to academic circles or were published in ways that emphasized Soviet achievements while downplaying German tactical success. The question of what happened to the German prisoners taken during and after the breakout added another layer of moral and historical complexity to how the battle was remembered. Thousands of men, captured in the chaos of the withdrawal or left behind when they could not keep up, fell into Soviet hands during the bitterly cold winter months. How many survived Soviet captivity? The numbers are disputed. What is known is that German soldiers captured on the Eastern Front, and particularly in the winter of 1944, faced horrific conditions in Soviet prison camps. Cold, hunger, disease, and in many cases, deliberate mistreatment reduced their numbers dramatically. Some estimates suggest that half or more of those captured near Cherkassy did not survive to see the war's end. This tragedy became part of how Germans remembered the breakout, not merely as a military operation, but as a moment in which men had had to choose between uncertain freedom and probable death in captivity. The survivors who made it through to German lines, and who lived to tell their story, carried a weight of survivors' guilt that colored their testimonies for decades afterward. Western military historians, writing in English and German in the Cold War years and beyond, had to navigate between these competing narratives. They could draw on German officer memoirs and interviews. They could consult captured German military records and Soviet documents that had been seized after the war, and they had access to the testimony of survivors. What emerged from serious historical research was a picture of Cherkassy as neither a complete German success nor a complete Soviet success, but rather as a costly and confusing operation in which trained military units had done what they could under impossible circumstances. The Waffen-SS units involved, particularly the Wiking Division and the Walloon Brigade, became subjects of particular scrutiny and controversy because their political character added another dimension to the historical dispute. Were they to be remembered primarily as soldiers following orders and fighting for survival, or were they to be seen as ideological warriors of the Nazi regime, their actions inseparable from the broader crime of Nazi Germany? The answer to that question shaped how the battle was told, and by whom, and for what purpose. Over the decades, as archives opened, particularly after the end of the Cold War, the historical record has become somewhat clearer, though not without remaining ambiguities. The evidence suggests that roughly 30 to 40,000 German soldiers did break out of the pocket, though the precise number will never be known with absolute certainty. The cost was very high, 10 to 15,000 casualties among those who escaped, with many more falling sick or dying in the weeks after the breakout. The Soviet losses were enormous as well, though they too remain disputed in the literature. Somewhere between 150,000 to perhaps 200,000 Soviet casualties occurred in the broader operation of encircling and attempting to destroy the German pocket, killed, wounded, and missing. In the mathematics of the Eastern Front, where casualty figures routinely climbed into the hundreds of thousands, Cherkassy was significant, but not exceptional. What perhaps matters more than the exact arithmetic of survival and loss is what the battle meant in the consciousness of those who endured it and of those who came after. For many German soldiers and officers who participated in the breakout, it remained a moment of collective trauma and, paradoxically, collective pride. They had suffered enormously. They had lost comrades they could never forget, yet they had also demonstrated, in their own minds, that even in defeat, the Wehrmacht could perform feats of tactical skill and organized withdrawal under fire. This memory sustained them through the final months of the war and into the post-war years, when Germany lay utterly defeated and occupied. For Soviet commanders and soldiers, Cherkassy was remembered as part of the broader victory on the Eastern Front, a moment when the Red Army's superior numbers and operational coordination had crushed yet another German force, even if that force had managed to escape the final encirclement. The propaganda value of the operation, for both sides, meant that the actual events were gradually obscured by layers of narrative, interpretation, and selective memory. The passage of decades has not entirely settled the historical questions surrounding Cherkassy. New research continues to emerge, particularly from Russian and German archives. What we know now is more accurate than what was claimed in 1944 or 1945, but it is also more complicated. The breakout happened, that much is clear. It was costly, desperate, and marked by genuine acts of military skill and genuine instances of chaos and collapse. How to remember it fairly, how to honor those who died without sanitizing the nature of the force they belonged to, how to acknowledge military competence without endorsing ideology, remains a challenge for historians and for the broader culture of memory that surrounds World War II. The controversy over Cherkassy is not merely about numbers then, but about how we choose to remember the war, whose story we tell, and what meanings we attach to survival and sacrifice in one of history's greatest catastrophes. What remains when the ideological architecture collapses under snow and hunger? The Cherkassy breakout, like so many winter campaigns across this Eastern Front, reveals something that no manifesto, no Nazi doctrine, no Soviet collective determination can fully override. The simple, absolute sovereignty of the body's need for warmth, for food, for rest. Ideology is a thing of words and will, but the human form is a democracy of survival, When temperature drops below a certain threshold, when caloric deficit becomes critical, the loftiest convictions of supremacy or proletarian destiny begin to feel curiously distant. Winter warfare on the Russian steppe presents a peculiar kind of adversary, one that does not recognize uniform or rank or the abstractions that nations fight over. The same cold that killed Wehrmacht soldiers in the Cherkassy Pocket killed Soviet soldiers outside it. The same frostbite, the same typhus carried by lice, the same pneumonia lurking in damaged lungs. History tends to remember the grand gestures, the orders held, the positions captured, the strategies executed, but the greater truth whispers beneath, that winter itself was often the true belligerent, and both sides were merely its subjects. Consider the simple mathematics of hypothermia. A man in thin uniform, standing in -20 degrees Celsius, breathing air so cold it burns his lungs, with insufficient calories to maintain the furnace of his metabolism, begins to lose the capacity for rational thought after perhaps 6 hours. His fingers cease to obey, his mind grows foggy. Within 12 hours, without shelter and warmth, death approaches. No matter how deeply he believes in his cause, no matter how fierce his resolve, his body follows laws that predate ideology by millions of years. The Cherkassy breakout, then, was not simply a military maneuver. It was, in some sense, a desperate negotiation with the physics of survival itself. The Waffen-SS Viking division, that collection of Nordic volunteers and SS men who saw themselves as inheritors of some greater Germanic tradition, experienced this leveling as acutely as any Wehrmacht private. The volunteer from Sweden or Belgium or the Low Countries, who had enlisted in part to be part of something transcendent, found himself instead struggling through snow, stealing bread from wounded comrades, burning his own equipment for fuel. What does ideology feel like when your feet are freezing in boots that no longer have soles? History is often rewritten by those who survive to tell the tale, and the temptation to impose meaning, to suggest that the hardship served some larger purpose, is powerful and nearly universal. The Soviet commanders orchestrating the encirclement, Zhukov, Konev, the ruthless pragmatists of the Red Army, were themselves subject to the same winter, though they had at least the advantage of defending their own territory, of being closer to supply lines, of seeing the enemy as the primary foe, rather than viewing themselves primarily as victims of circumstance. Yet even Soviet soldiers, moving through the same landscape, suffered appalling casualties from exposure and cold. The Eastern Front's winter battles killed not through honorable combat, but through a grinding, nearly random attrition that affected both sides unequally, but affected both nonetheless. There is something almost purgatorial about winter warfare at this scale. The enclosed space of the Cherkassy Pocket meant that both the trapped and the encirclers remained in close proximity to this weather that cared nothing for strategy. Both heard the same wind across the snowfields. Both lost men to the same illness. Both faced the question, how long can the human body, in aggregate, sustain this? The difference lay in logistics, in the possibility of rotation, in the existence or non-existence of secure supply lines. But the winter itself was democracy of a kind. How then does memory preserve such an event? The answer is revealing. In the immediate aftermath, in the camps for the displaced and the defeated, in the early survivor accounts, there is often a blurring of cause and effect. The Cherkassy breakout is remembered as a triumph of discipline or a tragedy of encirclement, but the role of the weather, the role of hunger, the role of the body's requirements often falls away. It becomes a story about men and orders, strategy and courage, when it might more accurately be told as a story about the limits of those things when confronted with cold. The post-war historiography of Cherkassy reflects this in curious ways. German accounts, written by survivors eager to establish the competence and bravery of those involved, tend to emphasize the tactical aspects of the breakout, the courage of the rearguard, the success in reaching German lines despite Soviet pressure. Soviet accounts, written under different imperatives, tend to emphasize the trap itself, the magnitude of the German loss, the vindication of Soviet strategy. Neither fully reckons with the snowstorm as protagonist, with the way that weather shaped every decision, every calculation, every moment of suffering. There is a broader truth embedded in this. Winter warfare on the Eastern Front was always a war against three enemies simultaneously. There was the military opponent across the line, there was the supply system trying to sustain your own forces, and there was the climate itself, indifferent, overwhelming, irreducible. The men at Cherkassy faced all three, and they knew, perhaps without consciously articulating it, that the third might prove the most merciless. What lingers in the historical record, then, is not just the facts of what happened, but the interpretive layer that communities of survivors and historians and storytellers place atop those facts. The Cherkassy breakout becomes a window into the values of whoever is remembering it. For some, it is a story of Aryan resilience. For others, it is a story of Nazi overreach and Soviet righteous annihilation. For still others, it is simply a story about men trying to survive the unsurvivable, a story that might belong to any army, any era, any moment when humans find themselves caught between geography and the decisions of distant commanders. The snow continues to fall in the historical imagination as it fell on the steppe in January 1944. It covers everything equally. It erases the distinctions that seem so important to those experiencing them. And when we remember, we add our own warmth to the memory. We inscribe it with our own meanings. We pretend that we understand it more fully than we perhaps do. The Cherkassy Pocket endures in memory as a moment when discipline and desperation, ideology and instinct, all met on a frozen field, and the outcome was determined by forces that no one, in the end, could fully control. The snow lies still now, across the land, where so much movement once crowded the frozen earth. If you were to walk that steppe today, across the terrain between Korsun and Cherkassy, through the villages whose names echoed with urgency and fear in those January days of 1944, you would find only the quiet of winter, the patient quiet that settles after noise and struggle have passed into silence. The guns have fallen quiet, the engines have stilled, the voices that called orders through the darkness have long since faded into the immense archive of the dead, where so many commands and last words and prayers were spoken to snow and wind, and to whatever lay beyond. What remains, in a sense, is something softer than memory, but no less real. It is the trace that such an event leaves in the landscape itself, in the way history presses gently into a place and never entirely lifts. Somewhere beneath that snow, in the soil and the frozen ground, lie the artifacts of those days, buttons and cartridge casings, fragments of equipment, and perhaps the remains of those who did not make it through the ice of the Gniloy Tikich, whose names were recorded in registries that themselves have been lost and found, and questioned, and reinterpreted by historians, seeking to understand what truly happened when the pocket collapsed. The exact numbers will perhaps never be known with certainty. That is not a failing of history, but rather the nature of history itself. It resists our desire for perfect arithmetic, for a ledger that balances cleanly. Instead, it offers fragments, accounts from different perspectives, documents that contradict one another, and stories passed through generations where each telling subtly shifts the weight and color of what is remembered. Yet something endures in the telling itself, does it not? When we return in thought to that dark night of February 5th, when the columns began to move across the snow toward the thin hope of breaking through to friendly lines, we are not merely reciting facts. We are standing with those men in the cold. We are feeling the weight of the decision to abandon the stand-fast order, the knowledge that staying meant certain death in the tightening jaws of the Soviet encirclement. We are sensing the discipline that held those columns together, even as discipline itself was crumbling at the edges, even as hunger and exhaustion and the terror of exposure to artillery fire threatened to dissolve every formation into chaos. The story carries us into that moment, and in carrying us there, it asks us something without words. How fragile is ideology when measured against cold? How durable is human will when pressed by hunger and the sound of shells falling in the darkness? The steppe remembers, in its own fashion. The land itself, that vast, white expanse that seemed to the men trapped within the pocket like an endless wilderness, an infinite space offering no shelter, that land continues to exist exactly as it is, indifferent to human memory. The grass returns in spring, new snow falls each winter. The Gniloy Tikich continues its quiet flow toward the Black Sea, carrying no record of the desperate men who crossed it in winter darkness, who drowned in its icy waters, or were crushed beneath the weight of horses and equipment, or who reached the opposite bank and moved forward into whatever life remained for them after the pocket. When we speak of such a place in the voice used for sleep, we are asking you to settle into the vastness of it, to feel the cold not as trauma but as presence. The cold of the steppe in January is not cruel or personal, it simply is. It presses against all equally, the German soldier wrapped in what remained of his winter uniform, the Soviet soldier waiting in his entrenchment, the horse that stood shivering in the snow before the breakout began and did not survive the river crossing. The cold is patient and democratic in a way that human conflict rarely is. The men who survived the breakout from the Cherkassy Pocket carried that step with them into their remaining lives. They carried the memory of that night, of the sound of ice cracking beneath thousands of feet, of the moment when they realized they had made it through, that the German lines ahead were real and not a hallucination born of exhaustion and despair. They carried the weight of those who did not make it, perhaps friends they could name, or strangers whose faces they saw in the darkness, but whose names they never learned. For the survivors, history became something personal, something they had walked through, rather than merely read about. And yet for us, listening now to the story in the calm of nighttime, in a space removed from that suffering and urgency, history becomes something else entirely. It becomes a kind of meditation on time itself, on the way that what was once vivid and terrible and real can settle into the deep past, can become quiet. The Cherkassy Pocket was the center of the world for those men for a few weeks in the winter of 1944. It was survival and death and cold and choice and brotherhood and fear, all compressed into one small area of the frozen earth. Now it is a footnote in longer histories, a moment that changed some lives and was forgotten by many. And yet in remembering it, in sitting with the snow and the silence and the question of what men endure, we touch something that does not diminish. We touch the reality that under all our systems and ideologies and orders from distant headquarters, there is simply the human being in the cold, trying to survive, trying to reach a line where someone has told him safety waits. The snow continues to fall on that steppe tonight, just as it fell in January 1944, just as it will fall for winters to come. Perhaps some part of those men remains there in the cold, not as ghosts or supernatural presences, but as the simple fact that they lived there, struggled there, and that their struggle became part of the Earth's story. When the pocket closed and men prepared for the breakout, they did not know that one day their struggle would be told as a kind of lullaby, as a story whispered in the calm darkness, to help listeners find rest. History does not work according to the wishes of those who live it. It unfolds according to its own mysterious pattern, and what seemed impossibly urgent in one generation becomes a gentle remembrance in another. As we move away from this story now, returning to the present and to the vast quiet that exists beyond any particular historical moment, you might think of the steppe itself as something timeless. It was there before the armies came. It was there during the battle. It is there still, patient and cold and indifferent to human struggle, asking nothing of us except that we remember, briefly, that men once struggled there in the snow, and that they did so for reasons that seemed clear and vital to them at the time.